The young man stood shrouded in smoke in a completely devastated city, surrounded by the ruins and shards of what had once been a normal life. There was absolutely no sign of anyone else around. Suddenly, amid the dust and smoke, he saw two glowing lights. Perhaps they were someone's eyes. Could there finally be at least one living soul? And soon it became clear that this was no ordinary person. Someone very strong, physically imposing, calling out to the young man to come to him. This man with a demonic gaze said he would wait for the boy at the edge of the abyss. The boy woke up in his bed drenched in sweat. Had he really had that terrible dream again? The boy rolled onto his side, hoping to sleep a little longer, when he heard his parents shouting that it was time to get up. They were running late, and even as he washed his face in front of the mirror, the boy felt as if he knew the man from his dream. At any rate, there was something familiar about him. Just then, his father came out of the shower, putting aside all that nonsense to focus on the usual daily chores. The man ruffled his son's hair affectionately because Sora had overslept and might now be late. But the boy felt that his dad treated him like a child. Even though Sora was already 15, Dad tried to tell his son that he needed to play sports to be as strong as a man. But if they weren't crammed into a tiny apartment, they wouldn't have to share a single shower. His father promised that when he got rich, Sora and his older brother Ricky would have their own rooms. Although he'd been making those promises for years. But his father said that things were much simpler now, since Ricky was almost independent. He had already joined the army and had been serving there for 3 years. Sora was also planning to join the army, but he wasn't ready yet to say goodbye to home life with his loving family and his slightly unreliable father, who often joked and laughed. And although Mom was very strict, unlike Dad, she was still loving. And in fact, it was a wonderful family where everyone was happy. He wished those days would never end. But unexpectedly, as everything in life happens, an earthquake struck, and all the family members felt it immediately. Sora had always known that peaceful life would end sooner or later, but he couldn't have imagined that it would happen so quickly and so drastically. The boy looked out the window in amazement, staring at the enormous tower that had appeared right in the middle of the city after the earthquake. Soon he spotted military fighter jets near the tower. No one yet realized that these towers would so drastically alter the course of human history. But Sora was certain that these towers were connected to his dreams, and now it seemed that his dreams had become reality. His parents contacted their eldest son. Ricky tried to reassure them, saying that he had to follow the orders of the self-defense forces and would return home afterward. And although Ricky promised to check in soon, judging by his weak voice, it became clear to everyone that the situation was very dire. The family spent all their time in front of the TV. The news report said that people were in no danger and should stay home while the military resolved the situation. Mom was very worried and scared. She said there were already 20 towers all over the world. With each passing day, the news became more and more frightening, and this continued until the news channels and television stopped broadcasting altogether. After that, information was only broadcast on the radio. And then one day it announced that all residents needed to evacuate to a shelter. The family quickly gathered all the necessary items, and Mom left a note for her brother, writing that they had gone to the shelter. As they made their way through the city streets, people could see that the situation was very serious. The military vehicles and equipment gave no indication that things would get any better soon. The soldiers' faces offered no comfort. It seemed these men understood just how dire the situation was, and their equipment was scratched by the claws of unidentifiable animals or monsters. A nauseating stench of decay emanated from inside the vehicles, and now even Sora's father was alarmed, not understanding what was happening. A temporary shelter had been set up in the nearby gym, and many refugees from all over the district had gathered there. But the people were frightened, barely speaking to one another. It seemed as though everyone was simply waiting for death. At the same time, there were still some unscrupulous individuals who enjoyed bullying the weaker ones. Just then, one of these bullies attacked a young boy who was about to eat a roll. The bully claimed the boy had stolen his roll, and then, despite the child's protests, the boy struck him hard in the chest. Many people saw what was happening, but no one was going to intervene. People were too preoccupied with their own thoughts and paid no attention to the bullying taking place right next to them. The bully leaned over the boy and said that he wasn't full from his own roll and would therefore take the boy's ration. The poor child, of course, couldn't fight back against an adult bully. He gave up his bread and was now crying bitterly from hunger and injustice. Sora's father grabbed the bully by the shoulder and asked why he was doing this. After all, they were all in a difficult situation, so why act like a jerk on top of that? The man demanded that the bully return the bread to the child, but the bully told the old man to mind his own business and shut his mouth. But before the bully could strike, the man knocked him out with a swift kick, and now the bully lay on the floor with a contorted face. The man picked up the loaf and returned it to the crying child, who was so surprised he couldn't believe that justice had prevailed. The bully got up and promised that he would definitely take revenge on this old man, but it was clear that the man couldn't have acted any other way in this situation. The bully looked very angry and vindictive, because he had just been humiliated in front of everyone, and he was planning to take revenge. It was Eiji Kagawa. This scoundrel, who took pleasure in bullying the weak, regularly beat up anyone and everyone with his friends. Moreover, Sora himself was a frequent victim of his bullying, and unfortunately, the boy couldn't do anything against Eiji and his friends. At that moment, a soldier ran into the gym. He announced that everyone had to leave the shelter immediately through the back door and get into one of the trucks. Many wanted to know the reason, but the soldier said he couldn't disclose confidential information. However, it had to be done immediately. The man in the suit was very angry. They had been kept in the shelter for several days, and now they couldn't explain anything, only ordering them to flee. The man said he pays taxes and now demands respect and explanations from the authorities. But at that moment, a noise caught everyone's attention. Then a soldier started shouting that they were here, and they needed to run away quickly. He looked very frightened. Sora started pushing his parents, saying they needed to hurry, and that it didn't matter what was happening out there. They had to follow the soldier's orders. The man tried to hold the closed door shut. He shouted at people to get into the trucks quickly because he wouldn't be able to hold it much longer. And a few moments later, the door burst open, and some kind of humanoid monsters appeared in the doorway. They immediately killed the soldier. These monsters were powerful, terrifying, ferocious, and thirsty for human blood. Finally, the people realized they needed to flee immediately, and they rushed toward the trucks the soldier had mentioned. His parents were already running toward the vehicles. They looked back at their son and tried to encourage him and make him run faster. When Sora reached the truck, there was no room left, and he told his parents to get in without him. His father tried to pull his son in, but the other people were very hostile. They demanded that the man get lost if he wanted to bring anyone else on board. Sora pulled his hand away from his father's and said he would get into another truck, leaving his parents in the car. The other trucks were also packed to the brim, and finally Sora made his way to the last one, which actually had a free spot. The young man had already reached out to those in the truck, hoping they would help him climb in so they could leave. But unfortunately, riding in that truck was none other than Eiji Kagawa, his worst enemy, who had also been punched in the face by his father. The bully threw Sora out of the truck, saying that the boy would die in his father's place. Sora lay on the ground as people ran past him, but the young man knew this was the end, even though it was far too early for him to die. The boy lay there begging for help, but it was clear that these were just words spoken into the void. But soon he saw a sort of translucent silhouette. Sora realized it was the very man from his dreams, and he said he would wait at the edge of the underworld. Sora came to his senses. He was still lying on his side. Could it really have been a dream, and had everything that happened just been a figment of his imagination? But then, right above his head, he saw a massive stone axe that was slicing through the air and rapidly closing in on him. Somehow, Sora managed to jump out of the way, just as the giant goblin brought his stone axe down. Sora started running, not knowing where he was. Was this hell? Why was he alone? And where were his mother and father? The massive stone axe flew right past his head and sliced across the boy's face. Just a little more, and he would have been the goblin's target. But the terrifying monster wasn't about to give up. The goblin was closing in, staring at the boy with bloodthirsty eyes. Sora ran away, pursued by the goblin. He remembered the huge tower that had appeared out of nowhere. After that, the face of the bully who had thrown him out of the last evacuation truck appeared before him, and also that mysterious, translucent old man who was determined to meet him. All of this flashed through the boy's mind, and he literally snapped. Grabbing a rock, Sora lunged at the monster. The goblin hadn't expected such a sudden attack. Sora had pierced its chest with the sharp rock and now stood towering over the monster's dead body. Sora began to examine his first victim. This monster looked like a character from a video game, and on its chest was the number 1, though it was unclear what it meant. Sora hadn't yet decided what to do next when suddenly the entire space around him began to tremble, as if a new earthquake were about to strike. And suddenly a magic stone began to emerge from the slain goblin's chest. Sora couldn't understand what was happening. He watched in amazement as the stone rose into the air as if by magic and approached him. The next moment, the stone pierced the boy's chest with tremendous force, and the pain was excruciating. The impact sent him flying far to the side. Sora realized the stone was lodged in his chest, but for some reason there were no wounds. It seemed as though they had instantly closed up. The young man felt a powerful force begin to spread through his body. It felt as if he were literally bursting from the inside. Sora realized that defeating his enemies would probably level him up. It was probably just like in a game. Sora picked up the dead goblin's axe and set off in search of other monsters. After all, there had to be more of them somewhere around here. Soon the young man realized he was on an island. There were no more monsters here, but he didn't find any other people either. It was a rather strange island that seemed to be floating in the air. Sora stood at the edge, and the only way to leave was down a flight of steps. The steps looked rather strange and dangerous. They were suspended in the air and encircled the island, which was shrouded in clouds. The structure looked rather rickety. Besides, Sora suspected that a monster might pounce on him at any moment, so the young man began to descend slowly. In games, this kind of area usually belonged to the boss monster, and if you fell off the stairs, you could respawn in the game. But with this world, it wasn't clear yet. Sora didn't want to find out the hard way whether this world was like a game, so he made his way down slowly, trying not to fall. The staircase ended just as suddenly as it had begun, and now the boy was standing near the entrance to some kind of room. Still looking around cautiously, holding a huge goblin stone axe in his hands, Sora stepped inside. Soon, through some narrow corridors, the young man reached a large room, in the center of which stood a tombstone with a burning torch on it. The young man had never seen letters like these before, but now, looking at this incomprehensible text, he understood perfectly well what was written there. The fragments belong to their bearers. Gather them all, and you will earn the right to leave the abyss. Sora realized he was in the abyss, and he needed to collect all the fragments to get out of it. Now at least, it was clear why he was here. Sora realized he was now motivated, and come to think of it, the goblin hadn't been all that strong. He absolutely had to survive and get out of here. The young man pushed with all his might on the doors nearby that could take him to the second level. The body of the first monster he had killed had the number 1 on it, and the entire area of this level contained no other monsters. On the second level, the area was smaller, and the monsters had the number 2 marked on them. They were 2 terrifying werewolves. The third level, one of the 4 monsters bore the number 3, and this level was even smaller. The fragments were found only in the bodies of the monsters with numbers. They were the keys to advancing to the next tier. The higher the number, the stronger the monster. But what worried Sora most was that these keys were getting harder and harder to find with each new level. The area of the levels doubled each time, and soon it was a vast territory. The number of monsters that needed to be killed was also constantly growing, and they were becoming more dangerous. But at the same time, it was impossible not to notice that the hero himself was changing as he progressed through the levels. As time went on, the hero changed, and the monsters he encountered became increasingly diverse and unusual. On the 12th level, Sora encountered the monsters that had attacked the hideout where he had been hiding with his parents that day. But now these monsters were no match for him at all. He easily disposed of them and continued on his way, destroying the monsters in his path. Soon the 21st tier was behind him, and Sora raced forward, stopping at nothing. By the 30th level, the number of monsters had reached 500 million, and it was now utter darkness. With each level, the search for the key became like looking for a needle in a haystack. Some monsters, the key holders, were guarded by a group of other beasts. Other carriers, on the other hand, hid in tiny caves, and he had to search literally every meter of these vast territories. But what annoyed the young man most of all was the amount of time he spent killing all these monsters. However, no matter the cost, Sora continued to do his job. He collected the next fragments and moved toward his goal. Another level had been cleared, and the young man moved on. The abyss of the 42nd level was teeming with all manner of monsters, which were in the air, on the ground, and underground. It was impossible to imagine how to kill all the monsters, and on top of that, find the necessary fragment. Sora tried to figure out what year and day it was, but soon realized that it didn't matter at all. The main thing was simply to kill the monsters and find the fragments. The most important thing was the death of monsters in all their forms, as well as the slaughter Sora was inflicting upon them. Everything around him is drenched in blood, and the protagonist continues on his way, paying no attention to anything. Sometimes, of course, you just want to cry because your whole life is fixated solely on killing, and that can't give a person anything positive. As he killed yet another monster, Sora marked notches on the wall to keep track of how many more he had to kill before the key was found. The guy's strength had already reached such a level that he wasn't the least bit afraid of encountering someone stronger and more powerful than himself. At one point, Sora encountered a gigantic monster that was most likely the key to this level. One of its claws was many times larger than the young man. However, no size or strength could stop our hero. No matter how strong the opponent might be, he would still die right here and now. And even those who believe until the very end that they are strong perish from a single blow. It soon became clear that strength, like time, had lost its meaning. Sora wanted to know where the key to this level was so he could destroy the monster. In those years, 20 enormous towers suddenly appeared all over the world, rising right in the middle of cities. Before humanity could figure them out and realize the danger these towers posed, all manner of monsters began emerging from them. These monsters nearly wiped out the human race, as they were many times stronger than humans. That day went down in history as Judgment Day, and most of the population was wiped out. But a few survivors awoke and gained access to a mysterious system, which granted them combat abilities. Those who awoke were granted immense power, and human society was immediately restructured. The awakened founded hunter guilds, after which they began clearing territories and leveling up. Sora was racing after the monster at full speed, hoping that this beast would turn out to be the fragment he needed. Suddenly, he heard human speech, and even froze in place for a moment. Someone was discussing the use of an advanced teleportation scroll. Sora saw the monster he was chasing get caught in some chains and begin to rise into the air. The young man surmised that the exit from this level, or perhaps from the game itself, was located there. He gathered his strength, pushed off the ground, and leaped high into the air. At the last moment, a notification appeared before Sora, stating that a summon from the abyss could not transport more than 2 living beings. At that very moment, not far from the city on Earth, there was a rather desolate area teeming with monsters and bandits. The girl tried to run as fast as she could. She knew she needed to hide from her pursuers as soon as possible. Suddenly, the girl's foot got caught on some plants. It seemed as though their roots were growing specifically to trap her. Yu fell to the ground, dropping her staff, and it was now clearly impossible to escape. Soon, a huge guy was towering over her, demanding she hand over the advanced teleportation scroll. The sorceress cast a spell. A level 60 scroll was not something a novice could possess. Choji demanded she hand over the scroll, warning that she would receive no mercy otherwise. But Aika begged him not to kill the girl. Yu reminded the pursuers that fighting between hunters was forbidden and that the rules must not be broken. But the barbarian Toshida said he didn't know any rules. Or rather, he was the one who made the rules here, and the man thrust his sword right in front of Yu's face. The men demanded the scroll immediately, but Yu advised them not to corner her, or they would regret it. Aika realized that the girl was about to use a forced summons. She had to stop her immediately. Toshida lunged at the girl to take the scroll from her, but Yu had already initiated the process, and now it seemed as though she had entered some new state. Soon, a teleportation circle appeared in the clearing, and everyone present realized that things were looking bad. Yu was determined. If she was going to die anyway, she would take them all down with her. The forced summoning was calling forth an advanced monster, and everyone knew that no one would be able to control it. They had to stop the girl immediately and interrupt the summoning process, but changes were already taking place around them. Yu completed the summoning and unleashed some kind of force upon everyone present, one that was meant to knock them out. Swordsmen, mages, and barbarians felt the overwhelming power and realized they were in for a rough time once the monster finished teleporting. A powerful beam of white light descended from the sky right into the middle of the clearing, scattering rocks and dirt all around. When the smoke and dust finally cleared, everyone saw an ordinary third-level Cerberus. This tiny dog clearly didn't match the description. Absolutely everyone was very surprised. Could this really be a Cerberus? How could she have summoned it? The guys immediately started laughing at Yu again for summoning such a weak beast, and now it was clear that it would be absolutely unable to protect her. But then someone's hand appeared right in front of the girl's face, and everything around them was splattered with blood. Some mysterious man had torn the Cerberus in two with his bare hands, and was now looking at everyone with a surprised expression. The boys and girls were seeing such a powerful humanoid monster for the first time. He had emerged through a summoning and was very frightening. Sora, and it was of course him, looked around and realized he'd managed to escape. Nothing else mattered to him anymore. The young man raised his hands in the air and began shouting loudly, rejoicing that he had finally managed to escape from the abyss. People watched the monster with alarm. His laughter alone sent shivers down their spines, and everyone felt an intense sense of pressure. Sora finally stopped laughing and rejoicing and began to look around at the people around him with interest. He approached Aika, who was too surprised to even breathe, and asked if they were on Earth. Upon receiving an affirmative answer, Sora started having fun again. He assumed these guys were cosplayers just having a good time. But the guys from the Tiger Roar Guild told the stranger not to dare underestimate them. After that, they all simultaneously attacked the humanoid monster, which didn't even flinch, and in the process, all the swords in the guy's hands shattered. Toshida was very surprised. He assumed that this guy was a monster. Sora finally realized that he wasn't exactly welcome here. He grabbed the man by the throat and began to squeeze. After that, Sora lifted the hulking man above him with one hand and demanded he show his number. Toshida had no idea what number he was talking about. The man could barely breathe because his throat was being squeezed so tightly. Sora had no intention of killing the guy. He threw him to the ground, but Toshida wet himself in shock right in front of his friends. Sora glanced at the group once more and demanded that they get out of there right this minute. He didn't have to beg or repeat himself. And in a flash, the daredevils from the Tiger Roar Guild were already running for their lives. Of course, they were determined to remember their tormentor and take revenge on him in the future. They were terrified when they saw his scars and sensed his power. You didn't understand who this guy was. He was hardly a monster summoned by a scroll from the abyss, but there was no other explanation. At that moment, Sora interrupted her thoughts and asked how many years had passed since the towers appeared. It turned out that 5 years had already passed, and now Sora wanted to know about the scroll, why the girl was dressed so strangely, and basically everything that had happened during his absence. When the girl finished her story, Sora realized that the world had changed drastically over the years he had spent in the abyss. Since then, there had been about 7 major monster invasions, and Sora's hometown had been practically destroyed. You explained that strong people had been sent there to kill the monsters, and perhaps normal life would continue there. Sora was deep in thought. He listened carefully to the girl and asked how he could get to his hometown. When the young man disappeared in the right direction, Yu was very surprised. She decided to tell her sister about this mysterious man. At that very moment, the guys from the Tiger Roar Guild were returning to their lair. They were supporting their boss on either side because he could barely move. Suddenly, a man, or perhaps a monster, in a cloak landed before them, radiating dark energy. This stranger addressed the men and said he could sense his presence. The members of the Tiger Roar Guild had exactly 3 seconds to tell him where he was. Everyone stood there stunned, not knowing how to react to what was happening. Was the same thing happening to them all over again? The next moment, the stranger announced that time was up and he was going to deal with them. And indeed, the entire group was killed. It was a very somber day at the Tiger Roar Guild headquarters. The girl reported that contact with Mr. Toshida's group had been lost, and the location of Yu and the scroll was completely unknown. However, the boss considered this utter nonsense and believed it couldn't be true, since the guys who had gone on the mission couldn't possibly have failed to handle the summoner Yu. She was too weak for them. The girl reported that their signals had stopped coming in all at once, which meant they had all been killed in a single strike. Rich Mukai demanded to find out who did it and under what circumstances. Furthermore, it was essential to capture the summoner Yu so she could explain what had actually happened there. Rich Mukai was furious. He said he would kill anyone who dared to lay a hand on his people. At that moment, the man saw a stranger fly past his window, leaving behind a repulsive stench of blood. The stranger headed toward the Fallen Zone, which was teeming with all kinds of monsters. This time, the invasion was on a completely different level. Major forces intervened to counter it, and the tower, which had been dormant for the past 5 years, finally sprang into action. And at that very moment, one of the most important groups went missing. Richt ordered all search parties to stand down because a new urgent matter had arisen. Sora made it to the devastated area of his hometown, and now watched the horrific scene from the height of a building. During all those years he had spent in the Abyss, his hometown had turned into a veritable hell. But in the Abyss, fortunately, Sora hadn't wasted any time. He had constantly fought monsters and had become very strong. Gradually, all his feelings and emotions had grown coarse. The young man had lost many of the human qualities that made him weak. One could say with absolute certainty that Sora had now become a monster who fed on his own cruelty, destroying other monsters in his path. But thoughts of his family had kept him moving forward all these years, and despite his cruelty, Sora retained warm feelings for his loved ones who remained on Earth. The monsters that the young man had once feared so much now seemed to him like tiny flies that he could easily shoo away without the slightest fear. This city used to be bustling with life, but now it had turned into abandoned ruins. All the buildings were destroyed after a powerful earthquake. Yet at the same time, Sora found no signs that monsters had killed people here. After the evacuation order was issued, no one had shown up at this house. This could be either a good or a bad sign. Sora made his way to his apartment and went inside. The young man knew he wouldn't find anyone there, but he couldn't help but come anyway, for this place was full of memories. Looking around and spotting some of his belongings from his past life, Sora noticed a sheet of paper lying on the table. It was a letter from his dad. "Dear Sora, everyone says you're dead, but your mom and I refuse to believe it. We took your things and arranged them in your room just as they used to be. We believe you'll come back and find us." Sora realized that his parents had risked their lives to come to the apartment and leave a letter for him here. They had also hung his favorite clothes in the closet so he could put them on whenever he returned. In the dresser lay a map to shelter number 6, where the boy's parents had gone. As soon as he read the letter, he had to find them. In the dresser, next to the map, there was also a family photo. His parents hoped that their lost son, Sora, would one day return to them. Sora took out a knife. He thought about how strong he had become. The young man put on one of the suits and used the knife to cut his hair short. He now wanted to end this apocalypse and reclaim the days he had lost. With a new haircut and a comfortable suit, Sora was ready to set out in search of shelter number 6. He had to head east, at least that's what the map said. But the road ran through the ruins. Blazing his own trail would be much faster, and Sora rushed forward toward his family. But then a huge, monstrous bird with a sharp beak and enormous claws launched its attack on the young man. In an instant, he tore the bird to shreds and then crossed the city in a few leaps. 2 young men were on duty, guarding the area. One of them heard a loud noise, but they didn't have time to make out what it was. The next moment, a powerful flash swept past them, and surprisingly, the guards still couldn't make out what it was. Another of their comrades ran over with a phone. He said he hadn't seen anything either, but had managed to record it, and now they could watch it in slow motion. As they watched the video on the cell phone, the young people were very surprised when they realized that this fast-moving object racing through the city turned out to be a person, one of whose hands was covered in blood. The girl was very frightened. She screamed for them not to come any closer. Meanwhile, above her, at the same level as the wyverns, Sora was moving from house to house. The girl sat on the ground. She apologized for entering this territory, but said she had simply gotten lost while looking for food. The guys were very pleased and told her not to worry. They were good guys and hadn't met a surviving beauty in a long time. The guys told her she had absolutely nothing to worry about because they were going to take good care of her now. The girl begged them to let her go, but the young man had already reached out his filthy hands, intending to take advantage of the defenseless, unhappy, and starving girl. Suddenly, a stranger appeared nearby. He said that some things never change and that nobodies remain nobodies. The leader ordered his companions to seize this insolent man who had meddled in matters not his own, and the men armed with daggers and swords rushed at the stranger. Sora easily scattered them without even raising his hands, landing powerful blows on them while remaining as calm as ever. He grabbed the swordsman who was jabbing his sword at the young man's face by the wrist and twisted it to the side, causing excruciating pain. The leader of the thugs was forced to let go of the girl, who immediately ran off. He said that the Tiger's Roar Guild wouldn't let this slide. Sora brushed his hair out of his face. Could it be that Eiji Kagawa had forgotten the man he himself had killed several years ago? The guy couldn't believe his eyes. Could this really be Sora Mukujima, the one he'd once pushed out of a truck into the path of monsters? Kagawa was terrified. He screamed for them not to come near him and couldn't fathom how Sora had survived. Sora grabbed the bully by the throat and began squeezing him with his strong hands. After all his troubles had started with this petty school bully. Sora said that because of Kagawa, he'd had to fight his way out of hell, and it was all his fault. The young man's hand continued to tighten around the boy's neck. He said that now was the time for Kagawa to go to hell. Sora felt his inner demons demanding that he kill this man, take his power, and subjugate him to his will. In the past, their relationship had been one-sided. Kagawa had constantly beaten and bullied the weak young man, Sora Mukojima. The feeling of pain, humiliation, and helplessness never left the young man, but today he would repay the debt. Kagawa bullied the boy and said he was mocking him because destroying self-esteem felt damn good. Sora threw Kagawa to the ground, and the former bully began coughing, trying to catch his breath. He had already thought he would never breathe air again. Sora thought he couldn't become the same kind of monster as those who had bullied him. But if he left such scum on Earth, good people would die. Sora said that Kagawa had once tried to kill him but failed, so today his life would be spared. But he wouldn't be able to just walk away from here. For making his 2 years at school a living hell, 1 blow. For terrorizing the weak, 1 blow. For throwing Sora out of the truck bed and trying to kill him that way, 2 more strikes. Sora said that now his opponent would take 4 blows from him, and they would be even. Kagawa tearfully apologized to the boy, saying that if Sora hit him the way he had just done, he would die after the very first blow. But Sora told him not to worry about it and promised he'd hit him gently but accurately. As Sora landed the second blow, a couple of guys from the guild appeared nearby, watching in horror as their boss was beaten. The third blow landed precisely and blood spattered everywhere. It was time for the final 4th blow, but Sora didn't want to just kill him. Sora wasn't some kind of monster. He didn't want to kill anyone, so he simply kicked Kagawa in the face with all his might and stomped his foot firmly into the ground. Looking at the work of his hands, Sora assessed Kagawa, who was left with neither limbs nor sight. He was completely satisfied with the result. Sora ordered the guys who were standing nearby in horror to take their older friend to the hospital and never show their faces to Sora again. Thus, Sora was soon able to move on, since he had already settled his debts and needed to continue searching for his parents. Part of the city was under military guard. They had set up patrols along the perimeter to monitor the monsters and prevent them from entering the area where civilians were. The commander urged the sentries not to be cowards or weaklings. If monsters appeared, they should not fall from the walls but resist them. The commander demanded that they remain vigilant, since no one could predict when a monster might appear. The private believed they were in a fairly safe zone and that monsters were unlikely to reach them. The private hadn't even finished saying that it was enough to stay on guard when, in the next instant, a huge monster tore the guy to shreds. Everyone else was simply horrified when they saw the Kraken's offspring, which had appeared right in front of the dividing wall and was staring at the people with its single enormous eye. The lieutenant ordered the soldiers not to let their guard down, to stay alert, and to open fire on the monster immediately. But after several rounds of fire, it became clear that the monster was too powerful and the military's weapons were completely useless. To their horror, the soldiers saw that the Kraken's offspring had risen again on its long tentacle-like legs and was advancing toward them. The first lieutenant ordered the soldiers to spread out, and then, to their horror, the monster launched another attack and sliced the soldiers in half. The lieutenant ordered a retreat and for them to take cover, but one of the soldiers was furious at that damned octopus and wanted to stop it. This brave man tucked a box containing an explosive device under his arm and rushed toward the monster while his comrades distracted the beast. The private with the dynamite approached the monster's body, preparing to place the explosives beneath it, while his comrades fired nonstop. But suddenly, the Kraken's offspring spotted the private, and now its sharp tentacle was rapidly closing in on the young man's head. It all happened very quickly, and the private didn't have time to react. But then the monster began to make a chirping sound. The lieutenant also noticed the monster's strange reaction. He realized there was something that had managed to scare the Kraken's offspring. He didn't yet know exactly what the monster was afraid of, but the private with the explosives realized this was his chance. He lit the fuse and placed it under the monster. A powerful explosion rang out, engulfing everything around in flames. Everything was ablaze, and it was impossible to tell how the explosion would end. When the fire died down, it became clear that the Kraken's offspring was completely unharmed. The monster was still staring at the soldiers with its eye, intent on destroying them once and for all. The private was utterly terrified, for his attack hadn't even left a scratch on this monster. What else could he possibly do in this situation? Just then, the monster once again directed its tentacle at the unfortunate young man, who was simply staring at his killer. But then, a man suddenly appeared right on the monster's body. He landed directly on its eye and began tearing the monster apart with his hands. The soldiers watched with their mouths agape. Now it was clear to them who exactly the Kraken's child had been afraid of, as its blood spurted in all directions. Sora soon stood atop the slain monster's body, from which streams of blood were flowing. The lieutenant couldn't believe his eyes. This guy had just killed a monster that not even an explosion could take down. There weren't many people in the country with such destructive S-rank power, but the man had never seen a reborn like this before. One thing was clear: he needed to gather information on the stranger as quickly as possible, and the lieutenant activated a special ability that allowed him to view information about a specific person or monster. But after activating this ability, the lieutenant couldn't believe his eyes. He had never analyzed anything like this before. However, the next moment, a system warning appeared, instructing him to show respect, and the lieutenant began to lose consciousness. The privates barely managed to catch him. Sora turned to one of the soldiers. He wanted answers to his questions. The private, of course, stayed behind to answer his rescuer, who was interested in how far the sixth shelter was from this location. The soldier explained that it was 50 kilometers to the north, but to get there, they would have to pass through Zone X, and that was very dangerous. The private explained that it was a kind of buffer zone where the monster's advance was being held back. They were lured there to minimize battle damage, and besides the monsters, there were also many hunters there. At that moment, the soldier standing near the slain monster began excitedly discussing what valuable items had dropped after the Kraken's offspring was killed. Sora realized that defeating monsters in the real world drops all sorts of items. It was very much like a game. Sora also asked the private how strong the monster he had just killed was for them. The private honestly admitted that a level 45 monster was a pretty tough opponent for them. For Sora, this wasn't a problem at all, and he wanted to know how many monsters in the buffer zone were above level 45. The soldier estimated there were no more than 100 of them there. Otherwise, humanity would have gone extinct long ago. Sora turned around and was about to leave. But then the same private called out to him. He apologized and said he had a rather indecent request to make. The young man bowed respectfully and said he was begging the stranger to go to Zone X. After all, a hunter as skilled as Sora could save many people, and if he had the chance, he should do so for the sake of the civilians. Sora clarified that the shortest route to the sixth shelter actually passed through this buffer zone. Upon receiving an affirmative answer, Sora said he would do just that. He would pass through Zone X and kill any monsters unlucky enough to cross his path. The soldiers returned to their camp on the front line. They needed to get the lieutenant to the doctors immediately. Lieutenant Kagura finally came to. He sat up on his cot and wanted to know how long he'd been out. A soldier reported that it had been about 10 minutes, but excellent recovery items had dropped from the monster, and they had worked very well. The lieutenant wanted to know what had happened next to the man who had saved them all. He was told that shortly after the lieutenant lost consciousness, the stranger said goodbye to them and headed north. Suddenly, the lieutenant remembered something, and he asked again exactly where the man had gone, and the private confirmed that the stranger had gone to the sixth shelter. The stranger had gone there through Zone X. He didn't care at all, and he didn't hesitate for a moment. The lieutenant gritted his teeth in rage. He demanded that they contact the main command center immediately. The lieutenant was very alarmed, as there were only about 10 minutes left until the appointed time. He hoped he would make it in time. Soon a private ran up and reported that he was trying to establish contact via the emergency radio. He soon succeeded and, still not understanding what had happened, brought the lieutenant a video call device. The lieutenant said that the information was classified, so no one knew anything, but this mission was different from all the previous ones. The fact is that Zone X, which serves as the base for the mission, is no longer a place where the military can contain the monsters. And now it had been decided to subject it to a massive bombing campaign with the aim of destroying as many monsters as possible. At the military headquarters, everyone was at their posts and communication was established very quickly. A woman reported that there was an emergency call from Zone B-22. Commander-in-Chief Renji Kumagai agreed to speak and asked to be connected to that zone. Soon, an alarmed lieutenant appeared on the screen. He gave his communication code, introduced himself, and said he had new, important information. The lieutenant reported to the commander that a mysterious hunter had just headed to Zone X. Unfortunately, he was unaware of the military's mission. The commander didn't understand what the problem was. Was the lieutenant really calling him to report his own failure? Why his subordinates hadn't detained this hunter? Lieutenant Kagura was very upset. He said he considered it necessary to urgently inform this hunter of the impending bombing. The problem was that this mysterious hunter was very powerful, and under no circumstances could he be allowed to die. The commander-in-chief didn't often hear about truly powerful hunters and wanted to know exactly what level the mysterious stranger was at. The lieutenant understood how this would sound, but he had to admit that he didn't know the guy's level. The commander summarized what he had heard. A hunter of unknown level was disregarding the rules and had gone into the bombed-out zone, and the lieutenant wanted the commander to contact him immediately. The commander's assistant said that most likely, this hunter would be dead by the time the message reached him. The chief commander found this very funny. He was once again convinced that the lieutenant lacked brains. On the other hand, he was great at lifting people's spirits. Renji turned to the blonde sitting next to him. It seemed the lieutenant hadn't been trained well enough, and of course, the commander wasn't in a position to interfere with other people's subordinates. But if he reported to his superiors that the girl hadn't trained her subordinates well enough and was hindering the mission, she would be held accountable. Tonosaki looked at this fat pig and wondered if he was seriously planning to set up his colleague when they needed to deal with the enemy. Ms. Tonosaki was very angry. On the one hand, the lieutenant was sabotaging the mission, but on the other, he was trying to save a stranger, fully aware of the operation's importance. At one point, there was a long pause in the conversation, and everyone was thinking about what was the right thing to do to complete the mission without getting into trouble. Finally, Ms. Tonosaki spoke up. She said she believed the lieutenant had no intention of interfering with the plan, but now she wanted to warn the lieutenant. If his reason wasn't convincing enough, she would personally bring him to trial. The girl turned to General Kumagai, hoping that this option would suit him. Kumagai really didn't want to deal with any of this. He asked the lieutenant to give a reason that would satisfy them all. Lieutenant Kagura replied that there was a reason because a stranger had killed a level 45 Kraken cub with a single blow. Ms. Tonosaki was very surprised. That meant it was a hunter ranked higher than A. Could an S-rank soldier have appeared? The general said that was impossible because everyone with an S rank was currently on a mission and no confirmation signals had been received from Zone B-22. The commander wanted to know why the lieutenant couldn't tell what level this stranger was, since the lieutenant possessed the ability to see that. Lieutenant Kagura was forced to admit that, unfortunately, he had been unable to determine the stranger's rank. He even had to admit that after using his ability on the stranger, he had lost consciousness due to information overload. This could only mean that this stranger possessed a strength of at least 100. Such power was indeed very rare. But at the same time, the general believed that this was no reason to halt the mission. At that moment, Eastern Commander Nobuo Yuasa appeared in the command center. He stated that the military could not cancel its operations for such an uncertain reason. Thousands of soldiers from 4 different units were participating in this mission. There were enough of them to completely surround the bombing zone in the security perimeter. The original plan was for the garrison soldiers to finish off the remaining monsters after the bombing. But if an emergency alert is issued now, the monsters will react to the sound and all rush to one place. If that happens, this area will fall instantly, and thousands of soldiers will die without even getting their weapons out. The situation is truly dire, but at the same time, everyone understands that we cannot risk thousands of lives for the sake of one. It's too risky. Even if we're talking about an S-rank hunter, we can only regret that he showed up so late. But unfortunately, there's nothing else we can do. Another minute of silence passed, and finally Ms. Tonosaki announced that she was rejecting the lieutenant's request. They couldn't expend the efforts of so many people just to save one. The decision was final and not open to further discussion. After that, the meeting ended. And although everyone, including the lieutenant, understood that he had done everything possible, the result was not what they had hoped for, and it is the final result that matters. The private noticed the car keys on the lieutenant's belt, and a brilliant idea popped into his head. The young man unfastened the keys from the belt and rushed toward the car, even though the commander was shouting at him to come back, since the bombing was about to begin. But the soldier believed there was still time. 6 minutes remained before the start, and he absolutely had to warn them. The lieutenant was furious. He demanded that the soldier return. Did the private really want to be court-martialed? The other soldiers waited for the commander's order, as they could have rushed after their comrade to bring him back. But the lieutenant didn't do that. He said that the private had made the decision himself and was fully aware of what he was getting into. Meanwhile, the soldier was speeding through the city streets in a car. He had to make it in time to warn the stranger. When the private sped off in the car, he did not yet know exactly whom he was about to save at that moment. After all, no one alive could have imagined that this young man would turn out to be the hope of all humanity. Soon the soldier realized that he couldn't find any trace of the stranger. Time was running out, and he had no idea where to go next. The soldier was taking the shortest route. Time was running out, and the stranger was nowhere to be seen. The soldier realized if he couldn't find this guy, it meant he was moving faster than the car. Soon the young man reached Zone 10. He could turn on the loudspeaker, and then the stranger would surely hear him. But at the same time, it was a terrible idea because the monsters would also hear the man and react to his voice. But the decision had been made. The soldier, sitting in the car on the wrecked street, picked up the loudspeaker and began sending out warning signals. The soldier introduced himself and said that he was the one the stranger had helped save from dying under the Kraken's child. And now the soldier wanted to warn his savior that this place would soon be bombed. Therefore, they needed to evacuate immediately. The soldier repeated these words over and over, and soon Sora actually heard the warning. Sora heard about the impending bombing, and now he understood why there were no hunters in the area. The local monsters posed no threat to Sora, but he wasn't sure he'd survive the heat from the explosions. Of course, it was better to avoid unnecessary risks. Sora noticed that the monsters were flying toward the voice and realized that the soldier had risked his life to warn him. The soldier in the car didn't yet know if the stranger had heard him. He looked out the window anxiously, and Sora decided he couldn't let this kind soldier die. The private in the car saw the monsters approaching him. He had indeed drawn their attention. He had to leave immediately, especially since there was only 1 minute left before the bombing began. On the other hand, the soldier couldn't leave because the stranger was still in the area. And then luckily someone knocked on the window, and it wasn't a monster or a beast. The private was simply happy to see the stranger alive and unharmed, who wanted to know why this area was going to be bombed. But unfortunately, there was no time to answer because time was up, and the air operation to bomb Zone X began. A huge number of missiles and shells were dropped from a multitude of planes. They fell on the hordes of monsters and exploded, tearing them to pieces. Soon everything around was ablaze. Sora lifted some rocks in front of him to use them to hide himself, the vehicle, and the soldier. Soon the bombing of the zone was complete, and this was immediately reported to the general. He ordered drones to be deployed to determine how many monsters had been killed and where the survivors were heading. After a while, the drones reported that no signs of life had been detected, and the general wanted to know where all the monsters had gone. The girl said that the monsters were still in the bombed area. They hadn't gone anywhere. On the contrary, they were completely unharmed, despite being in the center of the bombing. The military couldn't believe it and demanded to see the drone footage. It was impossible to imagine that anyone had survived such a massive attack. The drone footage showed that protective dome-shaped shields had been deployed over all the monsters, and the attack turned out to be completely pointless. The monsters couldn't have deployed shields around themselves, and soon the military spotted the silhouette of a man with long white hair. It was this man who had deployed the protective shields around the monsters, and now the monsters began attacking the drones, after which the signal was lost. And indeed, at that very moment, the monsters in Zone X were catching the drones with their claws and biting them apart as if they were nuts. Communication with the zone was completely lost. Ms. Tanasaki didn't understand what she had just seen. Of course, they had been told that this wave of monsters was different from the others. But it turned out that these monsters had not only hidden under the protective spheres, but had also figured out the drone reconnaissance. The military realized the situation was critical. They ordered absolutely all soldiers to evacuate the garrison and retreat completely behind the walls. But then the radio operator reported that apparently the monsters weren't heading toward the walls surrounding the zone. It was clear that all the monsters were moving in one direction, and that was Zone B-22. Ms. Tanasaki remembered that this was exactly where the mysterious hunter had gone, and that this was somehow connected to him. The girl ordered all their available drones to be sent in that direction. In order to understand what was happening there, they needed to find out what had stopped the monsters' advance. And in the area that had been bombed, the dust was finally beginning to settle, and it was now possible to look around and figure out what was happening. The private climbed out of the vehicle and realized with surprise that the bombing had ended. What's more, he had survived it. It was a true miracle. The soldier was very happy. He laughed and rejoiced, but the stranger said it was still too early to celebrate. If the soldier had survived, that meant the monsters were alive too, and they were all heading their way. Sora didn't have time to say anything else to the soldier before he sensed danger and ordered him to get down immediately. A drone flew right over the soldier's head, then fell nearby and crashed. The private realized that the monsters had attacked the drones. This had never happened before, and it seemed as though the monsters possessed intelligence and knowledge. Sora warned that they would have time to be surprised later. for now monsters of various species, types, and configurations were approaching from all sides, right in front of them. The private was simply in shock. He estimated that this was the highest level group in this wave of monsters, and their leader was level 90. Moreover, all these monsters looked completely intact and unharmed despite the bombardment, which meant that the soldier's end was near. The private had already started to panic, realizing that he was going to die right there, but his comrade was completely calm. Sora noted that they were both unharmed, and if the bombardment hadn't destroyed the monsters, they would now beat them to death themselves. Sora ordered the soldier to hide inside the jeep while he himself rushed forward toward the mountain of monsters, chopping off the heads of the weaker ones as he went. The monster leader was about to bring his axe down on Sora. However, the boy stopped it with his bare hand and now stared at his opponent. Pulling the weapon from the monster's massive hand, Sora leaped high into the air to attack the colossal beast. Sora was highly motivated. He gathered strength in his fist and was now approaching the giant monster at tremendous speed. A single powerful blow to the head was enough to tear it to shreds. Sora stood on the monster's shoulder, pleased with his attack, while the figure of the stranger loomed on the giant's other shoulder. And so, at last, they met and now looked at each other. Sora examined the stranger in the cloak with long white hair with interest. For some reason, the young man hadn't sensed this man's presence. The stranger seemed to have known about their meeting and was now completely satisfied with it. He had finally waited for it. Soon, the monster's shattered head grew back in a new form, and the beast turned to Sora, called him a thief, and demanded that he return what belonged to him. Sora had no idea what was going on and didn't know who he was talking to. The stranger, with long white hair, said that someone's power had been stolen and that he would have to pay for it with his own life. After that, a multitude of sharp swords were aimed at Sora, but the boy destroyed them with his energy or shattered them with his bare hands. Sora shattered the swords into tiny pieces and said that if that was all his opponent was capable of, then he was ready to go about his business. Furthermore, Sora turned his weapon against his opponent and said that it was impossible to kill him that way. The huge monster tried to knock Sora off his shoulder with his hand, but the boy didn't budge and had no intention of moving. Soon, military drones appeared in the sky again, watching the events unfold with interest. The stranger sensed their presence. At that very moment, Sora was calmly holding the monster's paw with one hand, as it was about to crush him with its grip. Sora said to the giant once more, if he really wanted to kill him, he'd have to take it more seriously. Sora thrust his spear into the giant, but immediately noticed that the stranger in the cloak had vanished somewhere. Sora hadn't had time to keep track of this, and was now trying to find his opponent, looking around. The stranger in the cloak was very displeased. He couldn't stand being watched by those vile, weak little people. These lowly creatures always annoyed the stranger, and now he pointed at the drones, which needed to be dealt with immediately. At that very moment, some kind of wyvern or monstrous pterodactyl flew up and grabbed the drone with its claws, tearing it to pieces. The man ordered the monsters once again to destroy every observer who appeared nearby. The man was hiding in one of the abandoned buildings and, unfortunately, noted that the monster had destroyed his drone. But despite losing the drone, the man still managed to complete his mission, and now he was studying the video footage recorded by the drone with interest. The young man in the mask is Sora. He was absolutely certain that the reason the monsters had changed course was because of this hunter. This hunter had single-handedly faced an onslaught of monsters. He needed to report this to the commander immediately. But the young man didn't have time to do anything because he'd been spotted, and now a monstrous octopus had burst into the room. The hunter screamed loudly, and at that moment, other octopuses were climbing up the building, clearly drawn by his screams. The man in the cloak ordered the monsters to kill everyone they found in the building, after which he began to laugh happily and rejoice. Sora recalled the words of the soldier he had saved, who believed that a hunter as strong as Sora would save many people and kill many monsters. At that moment, the private recovered from his fear and realized it was time to get out of there. He tried to start the car, but unfortunately, it had stalled. Sora decided that to quickly deal with the enemies, he needed to start with their leader, and he jumped down from the monster's shoulder. The young man thought to save as many people as possible, he needed to kill as many enemies as possible, and do it quickly. The enormous giant prepared to attack the hunter again and was about to bring his massive paw down on him. Sora managed to jump out of the way. However, the young man realized that after merging with the stranger, the monster's striking power had increased. The stranger continued to attack, spreading his tentacles around, He was persistent and wouldn't back down. Sora was finally able to get a good look at his opponent and was unpleasantly surprised and shocked when he realized that the stranger looked exactly like him. Meanwhile, the man in the cloak had gathered a massive surge of energy, ready to unleash it on Sora with a single strike. The situation was very dire because the sword turned out to be dangerous and powerful. On top of that, the stranger said he was going to kill Sora right then. Sora was very composed and focused. He watched intently as the sword rapidly approached him, especially since the stranger had said that death was the young man's fate. But Sora was smarter. He struck the stranger's arm with all his might and snatched the huge sword from it. Now the weapon was in his hands. The stranger was forced to leap back onto the giant monster's shoulder to avoid injury and gather his thoughts. Sora examined the sword in his hand closely. It emanated an energy that felt very familiar to him. Finally, the young man realized that the surge of energy was very similar to the power of the abyss, where he had spent so much time. The stranger in the cloak was clearly angry. He turned to Sora and said, "Is that all you know how to do? Steal other people's weapons?" Sora stood on the ground with a huge sword in his hands, listening to what the stranger was saying. But in the very next moment, the weapon in his hands began to fade and dissolve. This power of the abyss, it seemed to have a multitude of uses that Sora hadn't even imagined. Sora realized that the battle against these opponents would be a long one. Therefore, he needed to free the soldier and send him far away from the danger zone. The young man approached the private and asked if the soldier was afraid of heights. It wasn't clear why he asked, but it turned out the soldier wasn't afraid of heights. And in the very next moment, Sora grabbed the military jeep, hoisted it onto his shoulder, and said that it was about to take a flight. The guy in the raincoat was delighted by what was happening. He realized that this young man was a complete fool who treated the power of the abyss very lightly. The stranger began to gather power around himself, and now it looked like a giant flower or mushroom. Moreover, he believed that the strong did not exist to protect the weak. Thus, he activated the Eye of Darkness and was about to use his power to become even stronger. After that, a powerful attack was unleashed on Sora so that he would die, along with the soldier he was trying to save. Sora realized that his opponent was very fast, and even if he ran now, the enemy would surely catch up to him, so he had to do something else. Sora left the car on the ground and charged head-on, intending to simply destroy that Eye of Darkness. The protagonist was completely focused. He closed in on his opponent, gathering all his strength into his fist. But after delivering a powerful blow, Sora realized he hadn't done anything at all. It turned out that this circle was the true form, against which he didn't yet have enough power. Sora heard a loud scream and, looking down, saw that an attack had begun on the car where he had left the soldier. Sora shouted at the soldier to get out of the car immediately. But, unfortunately, the soldier didn't hear him. He was screaming in panic and trying to dodge the vile tentacles approaching him. In the very next moment, a massive burst of energy pierced right through the car, and the soldier only managed to make a gurgling sound as he choked on his own blood. Sora immediately rushed to save the private. He tried to tear apart those spikes, which had already pierced and destroyed the car and the young man's life. The stranger was standing on the roof of the car, advising him not to get angry, and besides, not to try so hard and waste his strength. Inside the car lay the soldier's body, which was riddled with holes, but unfortunately, the young man wasn't dead yet and continued to moan. Zombie energy had been infused into the soldier, and now, despite the holes in his body, the young man began to smile. The stranger turned to Sora and said that he, the seed of the abyss, had a wonderful fate: to watch those he cherished die before his very eyes. Sora was furious. He kept chopping at those spikes, hoping to reach his opponent and destroy him. Sora surmised that the stranger in the cloak took great pleasure in destroying others' self-respect. If that was the case, then he would reach the villain now. But in response, he only heard loud laughter, and the stranger used Obsidian Storm, saying there was no need to state the obvious. Sora did practically nothing. He just made his way through, despite the obsidian stones whizzing past and even injuring his body. The stranger didn't stop. He continued his attack, unleashing it again and again. But Sora held his ground despite the powerful attack, and said that creatures like these who do nothing but harm everyone really annoyed him. In the end, the young man managed to cut through those pins, and the vehicle crashed from the height to the ground, dragging everyone standing on it with it. Sora managed to jump up and catch the soldier's body in his arms, and together they landed on the ground in the arms of the man who, in turn, had wanted to save him from the bombing. The only thing was, that soldier had died a long time ago, and now an ordinary necromancer lived inside his body. Sora shoved the soldier's body into the car and apologized to him for dragging him into this battle and failing to help him leave the dangerous area in time. The protagonist sensed that his opponent was standing behind him, ready to attack from behind. Sora twisted out of the way himself and lunged at the stranger in the cloak before he could do anything. But the stranger stepped back and said that all these actions were completely useless, and that the newcomer, even with the power of the abyss, couldn't do anything to him. He was about to say that no one would ever be able to defeat him when a powerful punch to the jaw cut him off. Sora had no idea that he couldn't defeat his opponent, so he just beat him up and threw the stranger's body to the ground with all his might. The stranger couldn't believe what was happening. It was impossible. How could this kid have hit him? But Sora, unlike the stranger, knew that people don't stand still. They are capable of growing in their skills and abilities. The stranger soon realized that things were looking bad for him, because this man had learned to control the power of the abyss by watching his actions. And before the villain could even see where Sora had gone, the man was already behind him, preparing to attack. The stranger was forced to dash away immediately, just to save himself. He was ready to admit that his rival had turned out to be a tougher opponent than he had thought. Sora realized that now they would be playing a game of tag. He acknowledged that the stranger could easily outrun him. He had the strength for it. But he certainly wouldn't be able to escape his attack, and a powerful blow split the giant monster in two. The enemy managed to activate his dark technique again, and Sora decided he needed to strike at the core of its true body. Of course, he had to remember that it would be good to know where that core was. But on the other hand, his opponent would then be crushed once and for all. Sora was forced to strain himself greatly, but his power was enough to split the giant monster into pieces, preventing it from regenerating. He burned through the monster's body, and everything around him was engulfed in flames. Having dealt with the giant, Sora looked at the man in the cloak and said that now it was his time to die. But the stranger had no intention of dying. However, he understood that he would lose the battle. He said he would remember this, and that they would definitely meet again. After that, the stranger activated Unity of Shadows, and all the monsters present gave him their energy, which gathered into a single sphere. Sora used his powers to withstand the onslaught of this powerful energy, which was now converging in a single direction and sweeping away everything in its path. And when this hurricane of energy ended, the space around them was soon practically empty, and the monsters had vanished somewhere along with their leader. Sora was surprised that the stranger had used such a cool technique just to escape from here. All his clothes were torn and ruined. At least the photo of his parents had survived in his pocket, and now he could move on. Sora walked over to the car and looked at the body of the fallen soldier. This soldier probably had a family waiting for him at home too. Sora tore the dog tag from his neck so he could later inform his relatives of his death and burial site. Sora realized that his battle with the guy who used shadows was far from over. He had just absorbed so many shadows that he could attack at any moment. The stranger smiled and believed that the seed of the abyss had a wonderful fate: to watch everyone Sora cared about die before his very eyes. Sora silently resolved that he would definitely deal with this villain and would never let him reach the shelter where the civilians were. Sora decided he needed to rush to the shelter as quickly as possible to protect his loved ones there. At that moment, military drones reappeared in the sky, flying over the area and surveying it. Captain Tanasaki ordered the drone operators to thoroughly inspect the area and make sure that not even a mouse could slip past them. The rest were to move through the zone, examining every inch and remain on high alert. One of the drone operators looked at the monitor and couldn't believe his eyes. He wanted to report what was happening to the captain immediately, but by that time, Ms. Tanasaki had already climbed up the hill herself and saw that absolutely all the monsters had been defeated. She immediately ordered the drone operators to check all the recordings and report back if any information was found. The girl looked around and saw clear signs of the battle that had taken place here. Apparently, that powerful hunter, Lieutenant Kagura, had not only withstood the bombardment, but had also destroyed all these monsters. At that moment, one of the operators called the captain over because he wanted to show her something. It turned out they had found a drone whose memory card was intact, which meant they could view the footage it had managed to capture. The captain began reviewing the footage, and the more she watched, the more astonishing the videos became. Soon the captain recognized Private Masura, who had gone into the bombing zone, and next to him, apparently, was the hunter the soldier had tried to save. At that moment, one of the privates standing guard noticed a strange glow coming from beneath one of the rubble piles. Soon, some peculiar items appeared there: an energy potion that increased the user's strength, an ancient royal dagger, and a few other objects. His comrade also noticed the strange color and asked what had been found there. But the soldier replied that he didn't have anything interesting, even though he was clutching some sort of chest-like object in his hands. But his comrade had already jumped down. He immediately realized that these had dropped from the swarm boss, apparently some rare items. And the soldier said that taking items obtained by the squad for oneself was a crime. And of course, the soldier knew what to do in this situation. The private thought for a moment, then asked his comrade how they would divide it among themselves. The more brazen soldier said he didn't need anything except the box. But the guy who found the items didn't want to give up the box. He knew that legendary items are usually found in boxes like that. At that moment, his comrade leaned in closer and said there was no need to hesitate or think about it, because the private had no choice at all. Using his authority to intimidate the poor soldier, the guy took the chest and was very pleased, because he had finally obtained the golem's relic. Some more time passed, and finally, Sora was on the outskirts of shelter number 6. It began behind a huge, thick wall, and people and even cars were already visible near it. Military guards stood on the walls, and they were also at the entrances and exits to the compound, checking cars and civilians. But the situation was calm. It seemed the Shadow Master hadn't reached them yet. Sora descended to the ground and now walked through the streets. His appearance drew the attention of people who were struck by the number of scars on his body. Sora walked, constantly assessing the situation. He didn't sense the Shadow Lord's presence nearby, nor did he feel the presence of anyone powerful. And if there were no powerful people here, this place would be destroyed. Suddenly, a monk appeared right in front of him, literally blocking his path. This monk was either blind or his eyes were simply covered with a thick bandage. He said that Sora had very thick blood and asked if the boy had come from outside. For some reason, the monk started laughing when he heard the affirmative answer and said that it made him very happy. After that, he took out his wallet and pulled out some money, saying he had no ill intentions, but simply wanted to buy information about the outside world. The monk pulled out a wad of cash, rolled it up, and handed it to the young man, saying he needed information. It meant a lot to him. Sora looked at the money and realized it was local currency. He immediately decided to tell him everything he knew. The monk was satisfied, but before taking the money, Sora wanted to clarify one thing. As soon as they started talking, the monk, for some reason, addressed him as "Your Grace." And then the monk replied that dressing that way was simply his hobby. Just like covering his eyes, the man began to take off his mask, still laughing. The monk said he had recently caught some kind of eye infection and was now taking care of his eyes. And only when he got close to him and looked into those eyes did Sora sense a frightening light. This guy must have a reason to hide his power. It seemed a wolf in sheep's clothing was hiding in this refuge. Sora stopped asking questions. Instead, he asked what exactly the monk wanted to know about the outside world. The monk was very pleased that he could now ask questions. He wanted to know what was happening outside. Sora replied that armed soldiers were stationed on the walls. It seemed they were preparing for battle. The monk was certain that ordinary people hadn't noticed anything, but he had definitely heard the explosions. And the monk asked to be told everything related to these explosions. Sora started laughing and said that he had gone outside on an errand when he heard one explosion, but he wasn't sure of anything himself. He was so scared that he dropped the letter and had to leave his t-shirt behind as a marker. The monk realized that his companion was also hiding his power, which meant he had his own reason for doing so. After that, the monk thanked the young man for the information and paid him the agreed-upon sum. They said their goodbyes, but Sora was surprised. He noticed that the monk had walked off alone in an unknown direction, blindfolded. Sora now looked around with great interest. He wanted to know how many fighters of the same level as the monk were here, but he couldn't sense them. Sora walked through the city streets still half naked, but no one accosted him, and the young man wondered why the military allowed someone as suspicious as him to move freely through the streets. Perhaps people were now kinder and more tolerant toward one another because they had a common external enemy, and they weren't wasting their energy on mutual hatred. Once he reached the center of the shelter, Sora went into the nearest store. The money he'd received from the monk was enough to buy some new clothes. Now he could set out in peace to search for his parents. It was already getting dark, and the young man walked through the streets. Sora decided to start his search using the old-fashioned method. He took out a photograph showing his entire family. The young man approached a girl walking through the city streets. He pointed to the photo and asked if she knew these people. The girl only glanced briefly at the photo, but her face betrayed horror and fear. She said, "I don't know," and immediately walked away. Sora noticed the stranger's strange reaction. It seemed as though the girl had seen a ghost. At that moment, his attention was drawn to a young man walking down the street with his hands in his pockets, arguing with passersby. Soon the stranger approached Sora and wanted to know what this guy was doing there. The thing was, Sora didn't look like a local, which meant he had to explain himself and introduce himself. In the middle of the night, some stranger is questioning people using a photograph. Is this some kind of primitive communal system or the last century? Sora turned the photograph toward the young man and asked if he knew the two people in it. The young man immediately broke out in a sweat, and his face looked alarmed. He wanted to know where the stranger had gotten the photo and what business he had with them. Sora decided not to lie or make excuses. He said he was the son and pointed to himself as the little boy in the photo. The young man decided that this stranger was mocking him, but now he would show him what it meant to laugh at the locals. The stranger was just about to use his strength against Sora, but then a huge truck swerved onto the road, and it turned out the guys were standing right in its path. Sora didn't even budge. He stopped the truck with his own body, while his companion fainted from fear. Sora stopped the massive truck with one hand and asked the guy to repeat himself because he hadn't heard the answer to his question. The man looked stunned. He said it was very nice to see how the boy had grown up, and he was glad to greet him. After that, the guy pointed out which direction to go to find his parents' house. They said goodbye. Sora went to look for the house, and the guy ran off as fast as he could, thinking things were bad. He needed to get everyone together immediately. Sora walked through the city streets, and it seemed very strange to him that the thug knew where his parents lived. Come to think of it, his father had always been very kind to everyone he met. His mother had always treated people with kindness too, and there had always been a healthy and loving atmosphere within the family. Usually, this world simply takes advantage of good people, but Sora was sure that now everything would be different because he was back and wouldn't let anyone hurt his family. Finally, he came to a huge house where, apparently, his parents lived. The young man thought there were simply a lot of empty houses in the city since people had fled and perished, leaving their homes behind. Sora knocked on the door and heard his father's voice, who said that work was done for the day. The door swung open, and the man saw a young man with completely white hair. There was something familiar about this stranger, but the man still looked at him warily, not knowing what to expect. But then the stranger said that it was him, Sora, his son, and a tear rolled down the young man's cheek. The father clearly hadn't expected this turn of events either. He looked at the young man and didn't see in him the little son they had lost 5 years ago during the evacuation. Finally, a woman came out of the kitchen carrying tea sets. She apologized for keeping them waiting. Everyone sat down at the table, and the woman realized that her husband still hadn't started talking to the young man. The man could hardly believe that this was their son, Sora, because the young man didn't look anything like him. The man told his wife that this was exactly the moment to resort to this. He looked at Sora and said that this was a father-son exchange of secrets. And although the man would prefer not to discuss certain things in front of his wife, this imposter had to be dealt with. The host calculated that if the stranger said anything suspicious, Roger would deal with him immediately. Meanwhile, Roger, the man's personal bodyguard, was hiding in the ceiling, ready to kill the uninvited guest at the first signal from his master. Sora immediately noticed the assistant hiding in the ceiling, but he thought it was the right thing to do. His father had to be careful, and such reliable security guaranteed a peaceful life. Sora realized that an awkward situation was about to unfold for the bodyguard hiding in the ceiling, because he was about to hear something about his boss that he really shouldn't know. Sora began to speak. He explained that his father attended cooking classes at a housewives' support group every weekend. The accomplice under the ceiling was surprised, picturing his boss with a long knife and a tomato in his hand. He would have been better off not hearing that information. Sora continued and said that every week his dad secretly attended ballet classes. It was, of course, very controversial information, and everyone would have preferred not to hear such details. But the man said that his son might not be the only one with this information. Sora laughed and said he was ready to share more about their family life if these facts weren't enough. After getting his father's approval, the young man warned him not to take offense later. Sora turned around at the table, pointed to the sword, and said that this Japanese sword was just a replica. The man couldn't believe his ears. He asked if the young man had any proof. Sora stood up, took the sword in his hands, and said that there should be a bite mark from his brother on the hilt. The accomplice was surprised because that mark on the hilt had been left by his boss when his hands were tied, and he had grabbed the sword with his teeth and killed 38 people that way. The accomplice remained highly suspicious. He believed the stranger was simply pulling the wool over everyone's eyes, his goal being to lull the boss into a false sense of security and then finish him off. Meanwhile, Sora unsheathed the sword, then pressed it against his hand and began to simply slide the blade back and forth, folding it like a plastic sword. The next moment, the man rushed to embrace the boy, pulling this chatty idiot close to him, for they were certain he had died many years ago, and tears streamed from the man's eyes. He was so happy to see his son, for all these years. What hadn't they thought of? The man recounted how they had searched every inch of land for their missing son, and before the father had time to grasp the situation, he had become the boss of this territory. And now this boss was shedding tears in front of everyone, like some silly girl. The man sobbed on his son's shoulder and asked for his assistant to come down from above. The guard was quite frightened, for now punishment awaited him. The boss had spent his entire life under a rain of blood. The man had never seen anything like this before, but now his boss looked like a completely normal person. The bodyguard, much to his regret, had found the head of the family, a man who valued honor above all else, in such a dreadful state. The man realized he needed to quietly slip out of the house. He hoped he'd make it out before they killed him. But before the guard could crawl away from the peephole, Sora stopped him, saying that his father wanted to speak with him. And so they were all sitting at the same table. The situation was, of course, tense, and so was the mood of everyone present. The head of the family turned to the guard and said that this ugly little man had the biggest mouth. Everyone knew that. Sora also looked at the unfortunate guard with a smile and warned him. If this situation became known, the blame would fall entirely on him. Ochia was afraid to look up at his boss. He swore he would keep his mouth shut, but now he felt pressure from both sides, and it was clear that these were indeed father and son. But then the lady intervened in the conversation. She asked her beloved men not to scare the guard. Ochia was very grateful to Mrs. Mukajima, but she still reminded him with a smile that he really should keep quiet if he wanted to live. The father was already starting to come to his senses. He was relieved that his son hadn't told the guard about how he snored and farted in his sleep. Sora watched his parents, and he finally felt at home, as if he had just emerged from the abyss. Before anyone had a chance to relax, the door suddenly burst open, and a group of people rushed in. Leading the group was the guy from the street who had given the boss's address. He had brought the rest of the thugs with him and said that some blonde kid had been looking for the boss. Sora turned around and said that the blonde kid was the one. The guy recognized him right away and said, "Sure, this stranger might be strong, but he's alone, while he's brought the whole gang, and now they're going to show him." The guy assumed that this blonde guy from the Tiger's Roar Guild had probably snuck into the house on purpose to do something to the boss. Sora stopped the guy with a light flick of his wrist before he could smash his head in, and asked his father to introduce them to each other. Mr. Mukajima told his men that standing before them was his son, Sora, who had gone missing 5 years ago and had finally returned. The man wanted to explain what level his son had been at, but suddenly he realized he had no idea what Sora's level was now. The father expected Sora to state his own level. However, to everyone's surprise, Sora said he didn't have a system. This was unheard of, and it was amazing how the guy had managed to survive in the Fallen Zones for 5 years. It was simply unreal. The guys knew that if you didn't have a system, no matter how hard you trained, it was impossible to rise above the 10th level. The guys were starting to get angry. What the hell had their friend dragged them here for? He'd said the stranger was surprisingly strong, but in reality, he turned out to be a newbie without a system. Redhead replied that he must have just been mistaken, but in any case, that's how it had seemed to him when they first met. In reality, Redhead knew that wasn't true at all. A newbie couldn't possibly have come out unscathed from a collision with a massive truck. Sora realized the guy was confused and asked if he wanted to try checking his level using his system. Redhead didn't understand what he was talking about at first, but then he figured it out. If a person doesn't have the system, they don't have access to basic information. The system allows you to see monsters' levels, so you can properly gauge your strength during battles and duels. The Redhead immediately warned that without a special ability, it wouldn't work, and he wouldn't be able to determine Sora's level. Mr. Mukajima confirmed that inspection is a rare ability. Not all hunters possess it. Then Sora turned to his father and asked him to look and determine his son's level. Sora really wanted to understand the current classifications. Besides, he needed to gather information about the Abyss. However, his father refused to test him, so Sora turned to his mother and asked if she would check his level. But she replied that it was enough for her that her son was now by her side. Besides, she already knew that he was her best and most beloved boy. In the end, his father gave in to his pleas, but the result was nothing. No matter how many times the man tried to test him, the system didn't produce a result. Absolutely nothing was visible, and there are only two reasons for this in the world. Either Sora doesn't have a system and is operating outside of it, or Sora's level is so high that his father, Mr. Mukajima, simply cannot see him. His father saw his son in the registered name, Sora Mukajima, but no other information was provided. If we assume the boy is a complete novice, it's unclear how he survived over the past 5 years, which means that option is impossible. It turns out that Sora's level was too high for his father to see him through the system. Mrs. Mukajima said they should just be happy and not try to figure out what their son had been doing all these years. It was clear enough that Sora was a good and strong young man. Besides, the woman was certain that her son must have gone through a lot to be able to come home now. Sora suddenly became emotional. Images from his life flashed before his eyes, times when he had behaved almost like a monster, and tears welled up in his eyes. Mr. Mukajima realized that everyone was about to cry, not just his wife and son, but himself as well. So he began ushering the boys out of his house, since the mother had finally been reunited with her child after so long. Before kicking everyone out of the house, the head of the family asked about Jiro and the others, since 2 hours had already passed and they still hadn't returned. Left alone, Sora asked his mother if there was any news about his older brother. The young man was very worried about him and feared hearing tragic news. But it turned out that his brother was fine. He was currently in the army and was alive and well. His mother showed him a photo on her phone. It depicted a handsome, confident man who had been fighting on the front lines all this time, as if trying to avenge his brother. Sora hadn't seen his brother in so long, the brother who had always been his friend and protector as a child. After that, Sora decided to find out what position his mother held here, and the woman confirmed that she was highly respected and had a good reputation. The fact was that the woman had become a priestess. She possessed many healing abilities, which allowed her to provide great support, and she could even make prophecies. Sora surmised that as a priestess, his mother could probably see right through him. The woman replied that she couldn't see other people's abilities, but she recognized her son immediately. All this was because she could make prophecies and had always known that her son would definitely return to her. Late at night, there was a knock at the door. The guard opened it slightly and asked who was there. He was ordered to throw the door wide open immediately because the vice head had arrived. It was a huge man with a cross-shaped scar on his forehead. Mr. Mukajima was in a wonderful mood. He threw the door open and greeted Jiro, congratulating him on his return. The man immediately noticed his deputy's gloomy expression and wanted to know what had happened. The head told his deputy that he had asked someone to observe everything from the sidelines to see how things were going, and now he wanted to know what they had found out. Jiro replied, just as the head had suspected, the Tiger's Roar Guild had joined forces with the army. As usual, they handed over the monster carcasses to the army, but the man with the laptop started nitpicking during the inspection of the goods, saying that the monster bodies were too battered and he didn't want to accept them. He made up excuses and gave only half the points, even though he reported the full value to his superiors. And during the audit, the entire difference in points went to the Tiger's Roar Guild. The head of the Union Guild was very upset upon hearing this news, because this is outright robbery. The Tiger's Roar Guild is supposed to remain neutral, but they're pulling stunts like this, and things will only get worse from here. We can't just sit idly by and let ourselves be humiliated. This will affect the city's future. The guild leader thanked Jiro for completing the task and told him he could put everything aside for now, eat and rest. Mr. Mukajima said that later he would go to the Tiger's Roar Guild himself and settle this matter with them. They need to show them that the Union Guild isn't some naive pushover that can be deceived and used for their own purposes. Sora wasn't present during the conversation, but thanks to the dark shard in his chest, all his senses and faculties were heightened, and he could hear from a distance. The young man realized that the Tiger's Roar Guild, along with the thug Kagawa and the rest of the hoodlums, had banded together, and now his father was going to negotiate with them. Sora was a little worried about his recently found father, so the young man threw open the door and appeared before the men, saying that he would go with his father. The redhead was very pleased, realizing that Sora wanted to get involved, and that meant he would get to see his true strength. The guild leader introduced his son to his assistant, explaining that Sora had gone missing 5 years ago in the Fallen Zone, and had now returned to them. Jiro wanted to know what level the guy was at since he'd managed to survive so long in the Fallen Zone, but he was told that Sora was off-system. It all sounded very strange. It turned out that the guild leader's son was just an ordinary person. But without the system, you're as good as dead in any shelter. You wouldn't last more than 3 days. Of course, there's a chance of survival with elite stats and good survival skills. But without professional skills, you'd turn into dead weight faster than the fight even started. In short, Jiro didn't trust this guy. He was happy for him, but said that if the guy had just returned, he was probably tired, and it would be better for him to stay home this time. Mr. Mukajima himself didn't know what to expect from his son, so he agreed with the idea and told Sora to stay home with his mother. The woman realized she needed to step in. She offered to show her son around the house and the entire property. Sora wasn't offended by what was happening. This was to be expected, since to the people with the system, he was just an ordinary person, and he wouldn't be of any use in battle. Besides, Sora still hadn't gotten a full picture of this hideout. He knew there were monsters specifically targeting him, so he decided it was better to hide his power so as not to involve his family in this. Sora didn't argue and immediately agreed with his father's and his deputy's decision. The redhead was unhappy. He'd missed his chance to watch the chief's son in action. But soon the whole group set off for the showdown, and there was no time for sadness. Mom asked her son not to be upset. Dad was just very worried about him and didn't want to lose the child he had just found. After all, they had been reunited after so many years apart, and of course, his father didn't want to put his son in danger. Besides, Mom asked him not to worry about his father. Everything would be fine. He was strong enough to see into the future, and the card said that her husband would return unharmed. Sora suspected that perhaps his mother was making predictions to foresee danger. But if the Tiger's Tooth Guild had allied with the army, then his father would now be in conflict with them more often. Sora wanted to find out what the situation was like in the shelter and why the Tiger's Roar was hostile toward his family. His mother explained, after Judgment Day, the Hunters Guild, founded by the Awakened, joined forces with the military to manage the shelters. Sora's father had founded the Union Guild and was cooperating with the army in this shelter. They stayed here to wait for Sora's return. During that time, the guild had grown significantly, as all its members dream of finding their families. They maintain order, gather supplies on the battlefield, and fight monsters, while the military participates in breakthroughs and attacks on the towers. The guild leader is very kind and doesn't want to send his people to help with the breakthroughs. That's how they managed to preserve this place for 4 years. But a few months ago, a large hunting guild from the 4th refuge called Tiger's Roar came to their refuge to establish a branch. Since then, conflicts between the guilds have not stopped, and unfortunately, the military does not intervene in these skirmishes. Enemies and monsters are growing stronger, and the army is struggling to hold them back. However, the Tiger's Roar Guild volunteered to clear out the towers, and its power has grown so great that the military has to rely on them. Information about tower raids is so valuable that it cannot be ignored. Furthermore, the Tiger's Roar has an awakened one, chosen by the tower's deity. His name is SR, and he is the Tiger's Roar Guild's greatest asset. Sora listened very carefully to his mother's story. He wanted to know what a tower deity was. The woman explained that there are tower lords whose power is practically comparable to that of a god in the human sense. If you pass the deity's trial, you become an Isar and receive divine power. Outside the towers, such people are considered gods, and they also become guardians within the tower walls. Currently, the Tiger's Roar Guild has the most ESRs in its ranks. Since each ESR possesses absurd power, this guild is rapidly absorbing all the other smaller guilds. All the locals love Sora's father's guild, but it has never cleared a tower, and they are the only ones who still don't have an ESR. Sora understood that the situation was truly sad and dire, but that it could still be changed. At the same time, the young man wanted to know, if people love the Union Guild, then why do its members act like ordinary mobsters? And then his mom surprised her son by saying that she just liked that type of man. Sora didn't know how to respond to that, but his mom said it didn't matter because everyone around them was happy. The woman led her son into the bathroom and told him to be sure to wash up, and if he really wanted, she would come and rub his back. Sora was finally alone. He activated his senses and scanned the house and the surrounding area. The young man made sure his mom had gone to her room and wouldn't bother him. Of course, the young man had no idea and didn't suspect that the situation was so serious. Sora couldn't help but worry about his father. He opened the window and looked up at the dark sky. The next moment, the young man was already rushing off in pursuit of his father, while his mother watched her son leave. She asked the boy to rest, but he, as usual, was a disobedient child. At that very moment, Sora's father, along with his men, set off for the Tiger's Roar Guild. Sora made his way out of the house and scanned the city from the top of the building. A light was on in only one place, which immediately made the search easier. Soon the young man spotted the group led by his father, but suddenly Sora felt dizzy. It was very strange because ever since a fragment of the abyss had struck his body, he hadn't been sick or caught a cold even once. But then Sora heard that same voice again, saying that it would not let the seed of the abyss escape. Sora had no doubt. He knew whose voice was speaking near him now. It was the Lord of Shadows. Sora realized that this monster was concealing its presence, because to his surprise, Sora couldn't sense or feel it at all. But now he could be certain that this monster had made its way into the hideout, and he needed to stay on guard at all times. But the next moment, the boy felt a terrible dizziness again. It seemed as if everything around him was spinning like a top. The Shadow Lord's voice declared that he would not let the seed of the abyss escape. It was all because of his soul, which was marked by the abyss. Suddenly, right beside him, Sora could see and sense the Lord of Shadows. He immediately struck at this monster, but it turned out to be nothing more than an illusion, which kept saying it wouldn't let him escape. And all this was because the young man's soul was marked by the abyss, and so, in a loop, he repeated the same words over and over again. Finally, a bright beam of light blinded the boy. He was ordered to get off the roof immediately because he was shouting loudly and had been spotted. Sora noticed that the illusion vanished immediately, and he ran off, not intending to show himself to the military patrol. After running a long way, the young man stopped and saw the illusion near him again. It had returned. Sora realized that the illusion had vanished because of the light. Perhaps this was a way to control it. He would have to test that later. Sora finally made it out onto the streets where ordinary, peaceful people were walking. He stood under a streetlight and decided to check his pulse. Sora finally figured out the pattern. If he stayed in the dark for more than 7 seconds, the mark would activate, and he would start to feel dizzy. As soon as Sora lost his composure, various lines about the marked soul and the seed of the abyss would appear. After that, part of the Shadow Lord became visible to Sora, and he began repeating the same words over and over, getting on the young man's nerves. Moreover, only he could see this face. Judging by the fact that passers-by didn't notice anything, they just saw a handsome guy talking to himself. Sora soon figured it out. As soon as he stepped into the light, a piercing noise began ringing in his head. After a while, the noise subsided, the mark vanished, and Sora stopped seeing the Lord of Shadows. This hadn't happened before, because he had always been at his parents' house, in well-lit rooms. Sora realized that the Lord of Shadows could find him practically anywhere and would put psychological pressure on him, repeating the same phrases over and over. Besides, he's capable of launching a surprise attack at any moment, so he can't let his guard down. But first he needs to find his father and help him if necessary. Sora set off through the dark streets, talking as if to himself, and it was clear to passers-by that this guy wasn't quite right in the head. Sora walked along the lit streets, and there was absolutely no one around him. He could relax and not get distracted, and instead think about the situation with his family. According to his mother, the military no longer needed the Union Guild, which meant that its leader, Mr. Mukajima, was in danger. Sora had no idea how many strong people were in the hideout, but he understood that the army, in alliance with the Tiger's Roar Guild, wouldn't just sit on the sidelines. There was a very good chance they would try to destroy the Union Guild, and then he would have to protect his parents, even if it meant killing everyone. Sora thought sadly that he would never be able to return to those peaceful days. Soon, the young man saw a crowd of people ahead of him. It seemed he had reached the right place. Sora hid off to the side. He didn't want to interfere or show disobedience in front of his father's subordinates, but at the same time, he was ready to join the fight at any moment. Right now, it was important to watch how his father would conduct these negotiations, because in conflicts, violence is a last resort. That was exactly how the man had once taught his son, and now Sora wanted to see if his father would hold out until the end. But then the crowd roared, and everyone shouted with excitement that the show was finally beginning. It had been a long time since the boss had drawn his sword. Last time, according to the guys, the man left a scar nearly 20 meters long on his opponent. The guild leader looked simply stunning at that moment. His gaze was full of fury, and his whole body radiated energy and strength. He drew his sword and swung it above his head. Sora's eyes widened in surprise, his jaw dropped, and he forgot to hide. The thing was, there was a huge hole in the building that ran the entire height of the massive house. Sora turned to one of the men and asked if his boss had always been so strong and powerful. The man proudly replied that their leader was known for charging into battle without hesitation. Sora was shocked because his father had said that violence was a last resort. At that moment, the boy realized that parents usually lie to little kids. You know, about Father Frost, Santa Claus, and all that. The man confirmed that at first the boss had indeed been against violence. Back then, he still believed the military would sort everything out. But a lot has changed since then. The military doesn't care about skirmishes. As long as the hunters do their job and civilians aren't starving, they won't bother to break up a fight. So the quickest way to solve problems is with your fists. If you can't win in a fight, there's no point in opening your mouth. Talking won't help. And then talk. That's the motto that works these days. Sora used to think that the strong hid their power, like a monk. But now it's clear that you can run wild if you possess great strength. Or perhaps that's exactly why this monk closed his eyes, to avoid rampaging and to view the world more calmly. Meanwhile, our monk was on the roof of the building, observing from above the aftermath left behind by Sora, who had destroyed all the monsters that hadn't perished in the bombing. Yukio Shuzenji removed the bandage from his face and activated his keen eye. The monk saw that the level 90 monster looked as if it had been torn to pieces, but there were no signs of heavy weaponry on it. Yuki was frightened by the fact that there were so many powerful people on Earth. Therefore, he needed to proceed with caution, and he blindfolded himself again. Mr. Mukajima sheathed his sword and now waited for his opponents to appear. Finally, a group of thugs emerged from the building, and one of them warned them not to get cocky because the situation was no longer the same as when the shelter first opened. Mukajima confirmed that indeed a lot had changed because all sorts of annoying villains had appeared who had no business being in the shelter. The man already regretted that he hadn't destroyed the members of the Tiger Roar Guild when he had the chance. The villain began to say that the leader was probably just afraid to do it, so now he had a perfect opportunity to prove his words with actions. Mukajima was furious when he heard the insinuation about his cowardice, and he said that he would deal with his opponent right now and wouldn't let him get away with it, and he began to draw his sword. Seeing what was happening, the villain looked a little flustered, since he had already provoked the guild leader enough. So why wasn't his backup showing up? Or was that not enough? And the man continued to humiliate the guildmaster, saying that he couldn't even draw his sword because he was a real coward, which meant he'd be better off as fuel for the tiger's roar. But in the very next moment, Mr. Mukajima, drawing his sword from its sheath, lunged at the insolent man. And just then, a phantom-like woman with guardian angel-style wings appeared behind him, and she raised a shield that struck Mukajima. The Demazovids were pleased that they had provoked him, and the man had gotten himself into a fight. That was exactly what they had been counting on. At that moment, the military's chief representative in the shelter emerged from the building and noted that Mr. Mukajima had been the first to start the fight in the shelter, which is prohibited by law. No one understood why Mr. Usui was there. Could he really be siding with Tiger's Roar? Sora realized that this military officer supported the Tiger's Roar Guild, and his presence here was no coincidence. Sora surveyed the building, and although it looked completely lifeless, he sensed that many people were actually hiding inside. Everything pointed to the fact that the military's presence in this place at this time was by no means accidental. It was all a staged provocation. Mr. Mukajima also recognized the soldier Usui, who usually received people and goods at his place. Mr. Usui announced that according to Article 15 of the Temporary Shelter Security Act, duels were strictly prohibited. Violators could be punished by imprisonment for a term of 15 days or more, depending on the severity of the offense, or by execution, and the soldier asked whether Mukajima would comply with his order. Mr. Mukajima now understood what his opponents had planned. They had deliberately provoked him and then decided to use the law to arrest him. Looking at these confident faces, it becomes clear that the military officer Usui is not worried that his superiors will find out about his corruption, which is why he behaves so brazenly. It's clear that if they manage to put him in prison, they'll keep extending his sentence indefinitely or even make him disappear under mysterious circumstances. Mr. Mukajima also understood that without him, the Union Guild would fall to Tiger Roar and the others. But it's unclear why the military would go so far in their intrigues. Disrupting the existing balance? Perhaps there's a power struggle among them as well. Mukajima understood that he must not admit to breaking the law. He smiled and told Mr. Ushi that there had been no duel here. The fact is that as the head of the Union Guild, Mr. Mukajima could not admit to a crime without evidence. The soldier pointed to the crack that ran through the entire building and said it was a sword mark. Clear evidence of his aggression. Mr. Mukajima didn't deny that he had made the crack, but that didn't prove there had been a duel. It simply meant he had been trying to relieve stress on one of the abandoned buildings. But then the soldier Usui came down the stairs to get closer. He realized that the intelligent and self-assured Mukajima could put him in a foolish position. Usui said that in the current situation, Mr. Mukajima had no say in the matter. Here, it was Usui who made all the decisions. If Usui claims that everything points to a duel, then that is the case, and Mr. Mukajima had lost the moment he arrived here. At that moment, a large number of soldiers appeared from the building's windows, aiming their weapons at the guild members. The guild leader was smart, and he understood that he had to act very cautiously. While Redhead urged his leader not to give in, but to fight these people right away. Mr. Mukajima told the soldier to hold his horses because his men were currently in the line of fire and wouldn't shoot at civilians. The guild leader was actually devising a plan of action. He understood that the military officer Usui was too strong, but if they took a representative of the Tiger Roar as a hostage, they might be able to break through. Tsuchida soon sensed the power emanating from the enemy. He immediately activated his shield because he had no intention of being the weak link. But this character's defensive abilities were different from those of other classes. He could analyze incoming attacks. But Mr. Mukajima understood that even at this distance, he was capable of blocking his opponent. The Milky Shield can only withstand swords. However, the level of this resistance is much higher than that of other shields. Tsuchidu was confident that his shield could withstand an attack from a warrior of the same caliber as the head of the Union Guild. The villain hid behind his spiked shield and was already beginning to laugh in his face, for his opponent would not be able to pierce this powerful shield. The military officer Usui turned to the guild leader and asked if he was now willing to go to prison on his own, or if he should be thrown in there along with his comrades. Jiro and the other guild members did not want to let their leader go to prison and now watched the situation with anxiety. Mr. Mukajima sheathed his sword, unfastened it from his belt, and handed it to the soldier. It was the only wise thing to do in this situation. Among the members of the Union Guild, there was no consensus either. Some believed that the leader had struck the building just for show, but there were also smart people who understood that the leader had surrendered in order to protect his people. Jiro silently watched what was happening. The leader had made an agreement. When he raised his sword, it meant they had to get ready, and when he lowered it, they had to attack. The rest of the guild members were unaware that there was a special secret communication technique between the guild master and his deputy. Jiro was ready and watched closely. He saw the moment when Mukajima let go of his sword. The sword vanished instantly, and Mukajima himself lunged at Tsuchida, circling around the soldier and preparing to fight with his bare hands. Of course, this shield had a spell that blocked sword attacks, and the villain hoped that this would help him. Finding himself face to face with his opponent, Mukajima drew his sword and prepared to attack. Tsuchida smiled a nasty, smug smile. He knew that even a warrior as strong as the guildmaster wouldn't be able to cut through his shield. But at that moment, Jiro stepped in. He extended his hand toward Tsuchidu and activated his active skill. As a result, the guildmaster's attack succeeded, and the protective shield shattered into tiny pieces. Tsuchidu had just enough time to notice that for some reason, his opponent was holding a hammer instead of a sword. Everything happened very quickly. The soldier Usui drew a dagger. He said that Mukajima wanted to kill him personally, so he was defending himself. Jiro directed his skill against the soldier, blocking his attack, and now the man could do nothing with his knife. Tsuchida felt as if he were paralyzed. He shouted to his men that the Union Guild had gone mad and they needed to be killed. The soldiers opened fire, but Jiro continued to maintain his active skill, which created a protective barrier. Mr. Mukajima thought that as long as the situation was under control, and if they could just stop the opponents, they could quickly get out of there. Because, of course, the situation was not going in the Union Guild's favor. The guild leader was about to deal with the enemy when suddenly something flew past him very quickly, and he didn't even have time to see what it was. The soldier was very pleased. He said that the stone wall Jiro had created had cast him into shadow and that it was a very useful skill in combat. But the fact was that he himself had noticed the remnants of light magic on Tsuchida's shield. Thanks to this, the conditions for activating the assassin's ability, Shadow Trans, were met. And now the soldier Usui was able to pull Tsuchida toward him, and without a hostage, the guildmaster had no chance of winning this fight. Usui suggested he surrender right now. The guildmaster was very surprised. He stared, unable to believe his eyes. All the rank-and-file members and soldiers stood with their mouths agape, staring in one direction. They wanted their commander to explain the situation to them. Usui couldn't understand what had so surprised and impressed everyone present, but then he felt someone's hand on his shoulder. It was unclear how this person had managed to sneak up behind him so quickly. Sora now stood between the two villains, holding them by the shoulders and asking what had surprised them so much. Usui was very tense. He wanted to figure out who this person was and how the stranger had managed to sneak up on the assassin unnoticed. Could this be backup for Mukujima? The soldier didn't know who was beside him, but he knew it was an enemy. Whoever struck first would win. So the man realized it was time to take advantage of the situation, and he began quietly pulling a small bottle containing some kind of potion from his pocket. Tsuchidu noticed this movement. He knew the bottle contained a deadly poison that the Tiger Roar Guild had prepared to kill a level 90 monster. It was unclear when the soldier had managed to steal it. Usui flung the vial of poison aside. Then with a sharp swing of his dagger, he slashed the bottle open so that the potion would spread throughout the area. Tsuchida tried not to breathe. He realized that this vile soldier had decided to destroy them all. The rank-and-file soldiers, like mindless sheep, stared at the mist spreading around them and breathed it in deeply. They had no idea what it was. Tsuchidu realized the fight had reached a stalemate. It was no longer a laughing matter, but at least Mukujima's ally, who had so unexpectedly appeared near them, had been killed. However, at that very moment, someone grabbed the two villains by the scruff of the neck and held them tight, preventing them from escaping the epicenter of the spreading poisonous fog. Sora felt great. He clenched both of the soldiers' daggers between his teeth, and now the villains realized they were dealing with a true monster. To them, Sora seemed like a true monster, one that was immune to the poison used to kill monsters, and he held the two of them firmly as they tried to escape. Depending on their specialization, a player's stats vary, but they always include intelligence, perception, strength, dexterity, and constitution. If the stranger is capable of withstanding this poison, then his constitution stat is on par with that of a level 100 player. Tsuchida stared at the stranger in horror, realizing he never expected to encounter such a defender at the guild leader's side. Sora ordered the villains to tell their men to lay down their weapons and retreat, but instead of obeying, a brawl broke out between the men. And in the very next moment, the soldier Usui, seizing his chance, leaped onto Sora's shoulder, pinned his arm, and was ready to break it. But before the villains could take advantage of the opportunity, Sora threw both of them to the ground with all his might, not giving them a chance to do anything against him. Mr. Mukujima watched his son with utter delight as two fleeing enemies whizzed past his head at tremendous speed. They slammed into the stone wall with all their might, and Mr. Mukujima felt a shockwave as if several bombs had exploded near him. And it was just his boy throwing the bad guys off him. Usui was ready to admit that this unknown player was very strong, but it was unclear how he would react to the shadow trance. And now the soldier was already behind Sora with a dagger in his hands. He thrust his dagger into the young man's back, but at the last moment his hand wouldn't obey him for some reason, and Usui was forced to push with all his might. The soldier continued to press, but he felt as though the stranger's body were made of steel, and the knife wouldn't penetrate the flesh at all. It felt as if he were stabbing a rock. Sora let his opponent enjoy his failed attack, turned around and struck him in the chest with all his might. Usui no longer understood what was happening at all. This guy had wounded him with just his bare hand, despite the bulletproof vest. The soldier realized he needed to retreat, but just at that moment, Sora grabbed him by the face and slammed him to the ground with all his might, crushing his nose so hard that blood spurted in all directions. Satisfied that Usui was no longer trying to get up and was lying motionless, Sora got up from the man and began to look around. After that, he grabbed Usui by the scruff of his neck and carried him over to the soldiers, tossing him at their feet. The rank-and-file soldiers were smarter than their commander and had no intention of avenging him. Sora told his father that his men would handle the rest and that they should go home quietly, since their mother was waiting for them. The Mukujima residence was completely silent, and the guards were even afraid to breathe too deeply. Mom was glad that her men had returned safe and sound. She asked her husband if everything was all right, and he confirmed that everything had gone perfectly. The guild leader tried to get some details, taking a few guys with him, but they were as silent as partisans. In this situation, it didn't matter. Now the Union Guild had discovered the location of Tiger's Roar, and they had to be prepared for anything. But right now, the guildmaster didn't want to think about Tiger's Roar at all, because his mind was occupied with something entirely different. The father turned to his son. He wanted to know what had been happening with Sora over the past 5 years. Sora admitted that after he understood what was going on here between the guilds, he was able to realize what he had done over the past few years. 5 years ago, the boy had been transported to a strange reality, and all that time he had been slaying monsters there. It must have been one of the towers, and he had found himself trapped inside. After that, Sora told his parents everything that had happened to him in the tower, how he got there, how he killed the first goblin and got a shard lodged in his chest, and how he went on to slay monsters on every level. In the end, Sora admitted that, apart from the summons back to Earth, he couldn't explain anything else because he didn't fully understand it himself. His father was deep in thought. He knew of 16 towers, but none of them matched the description his son had given. Jiro believed that if this tower was near their hideout, then they needed to clear it out, and that was now the top priority. In the end, the father was happy that his son had survived the terrible situation he had found himself in. But it wasn't just that he had survived. Jiro was glad that the boy had returned many times stronger than any of them. Be that as it may, the greatest joy was that their son had returned home, and now his parents would not let anyone or anything tear their family apart. Sora noticed that his parents' hands were also covered in scars, and the young man decided that he would never leave them again and would protect them. Everything was wonderful, but completely unexpectedly, the lights went out and the power went out. It was very strange because the power was rarely cut off in the shelter, but Jiro said that the forecast had predicted a thunderstorm, and perhaps that was the cause of the problem. But Sora knew the situation was very bad. He had already sensed that the Lord of Shadows was coming for him in the darkness, and sure enough, he soon appeared beside Sora and said that this time he wouldn't let the boy get away. Sora knew that this shadow companion had appeared, but this time his words were different from what he had said in the past. Moreover, Sora noticed that his father and mother could not see the Shadow Lord, even though they were also awakened. But at that moment, the Shadow Lord looked very surprised and gradually began to fade away. Sora couldn't understand what had happened. Had the spell been broken? But soon the young man realized that the Shadow Lord had simply left his body. A few moments passed, and now the stranger in the cloak was standing next to him, full-sized. He was glad to greet the Seed of the Abyss. Sora realized that his shadow companion wanted to be considered a separate entity, but it was already clear that he couldn't manifest physically, which meant he was an illusion. At that moment, the Shadow Lord leaned toward him and said that there was no need to pretend Sora couldn't hear him, and that he shouldn't consider him an illusion. Of course, people love to deceive themselves. But now the Shadow Lord covered Sora's eyes with his hands and asked if the boy still considered him an illusion. Sora said he couldn't see a thing. Could all of this really be happening? His parents and Jiro stared at the boy in surprise, not understanding what was happening. Sora was enveloped in some kind of dark energy. It was literally emanating from his body. Mr. Mukajima was very alarmed. He couldn't understand what was happening to his son's eyes. His mother immediately began applying her healing techniques and initiated the purification process. The woman sensed that her son was not under the influence of a curse, but she still could not find an explanation for his condition. Sora thought that this time the Shadow Lord had created a real physical manifestation of himself, which meant that things were bad and everyone was in danger. Sora, despite being blind, was able to see his opponent and rush to attack him. The Shadow Lord, though he was grabbed by the throat, continued to mock the young man and ask if he was afraid. The boy's parents were very worried. They could see their son fighting someone, but they couldn't see the enemy. And even his mother, who was a seer, couldn't see anyone. Sora still had his opponent by the throat and asked why this cowardly bastard was chasing him. But then the Shadow Lord said that Sora must have misunderstood him, but come to think of it, he hadn't actually introduced himself. It turned out that he was Fudel, the god of darkness, from the noble divine race of AS. Sora once absorbed the black crystal, the divine power of the AS race left behind in the abyss. To put it simply, Sora absorbed the power of darkness that belonged to Fudel. And now the god's minions are keeping a close eye on the guy because he left the abyss of his own accord. These very minions are already gathering nearby, and if Sora doesn't want to die, he needs to return to the tower with Fudel. Sora held his opponent back, but thought that God's minions were probably the Ezras his mother had told him about. His father couldn't wait any longer. He didn't understand what was happening, but he drew his sword and was about to kill someone. However, his wife stopped him and said that they should just watch for now. Sora continued talking with Fudel and said that, by the looks of it, the gods weren't having an easy time of it either. The young man kept his grip on his opponent's throat and wanted to know what a couple of Ezras could possibly do to him. Fudel advised him not to show off just because Sora had managed to beat him once by sheer luck. Other Ezras were no match for his current level of power, and Fudel had been able to blind Sora without even breaking a sweat. Sora wanted to know why on earth he should believe his interlocutor, since it could just be a bluff. Fudel laughed and said that, of course, the guy didn't have to believe him, but once the place was drenched in blood, it would be too late to regret anything. Sora knew he shouldn't trust this creature, but at the same time, he couldn't deny that it might be true. But then a glow appeared, and Fudel immediately tensed up. With every passing moment, the light illuminated the room more and more. And now Fudel was screaming and wheezing loudly, as if he'd been dropped into a sizzling hot pan. Suddenly, Sora realized he could see everything again, and the young man watched as his opponent dissolved, while everything around him was bathed in some kind of divine light. Mr. Mukujima was very pleased when he saw Mr. Shuzengi standing before him, who had arrived just in time. And indeed, standing in the doorway was none other than the monk Sora had met near the entrance to the refuge. Father was very pleased. He said that this monk, Yukio, was not just an acquaintance, but a good friend with whom he had founded this guild. Fudel was still there. He turned to the monk and told Shuzenji to let him go immediately. Sora was surprised. Could the monk really see Fudel? Yukio opened one eye and said he had an urgent matter to discuss. The guildmaster wanted to know what was going on, but the monk promised to explain everything as soon as he had spoken with the master's son. Eventually, everyone else left, and Sora asked the monk what had happened and why their conversation was so urgent. The monk explained that he was not an Isar, but his eyes were capable of seeing divine power. This was because Yukio had studied a forbidden art in order to seal the god of darkness himself. Although the divine power Sora possesses is of the same nature, the might of the god of darkness surpasses that of any deity. Yukio didn't know how this power had come to the boy, but there was no time to figure it out now, because incredibly powerful beings were flocking to the city. Most likely they are drawn here by the power Sora now possesses, and there is nothing that can be done about it. The monk didn't know exactly what had happened between the boy and the god of darkness, but Fudel's words were the absolute truth. However, Sora must not return to the abyss, because the inhabitants of the tower are far more terrifying than these Ezras. They are eager to deceive him, to lure Sora back into the tower so they can take away his divine power. The best course of action would be to leave this refuge and join the military. Sora asked, "Are you really talking about those people who wanted to blow him up?" Yukio just laughed in response, saying that the military was part of the mix. However, there are trustworthy people among them, and the Ezras wouldn't dare touch the young man if he officially joined the military. Sora wanted to know if his departure could guarantee his family's safety. The monk confirmed that this was indeed the case. The Ezras were bound by unspoken rules and did not interfere in the lives of ordinary citizens without cause. On top of everything else, the Ezras wouldn't dare act rashly in the monk's presence. After all, he was just as powerful as they were. Everyone in the Tiger Roar Guild was outraged by the idiotic mission. Not only did the guy lack a system, but they'd also lost 4 Ezras. According to the report, Sakui Mukujima's son went missing several years ago. There is a high probability that he was dragged away by one of the towers. An ESR named Shirai believed that his comrade Hiro would be enough to deal with his son. Rimu, like her comrades, also thought that this guy was nothing special and that they didn't need to go out altogether. However, the boss said that this time he would personally take part in the operation. All the Ezras were very surprised. They hadn't expected the boss to get personally involved. The man said that the order had come directly from Zeus. This pesky Sora Mukujima must be eliminated at any cost. The tower near shelter number 6 was about to activate, and everyone understood perfectly well how important it was to seize control of it. The stubborn Union Guild rejected Tiger Roar's proposal and plans to conduct an independent investigation of this tower. Therefore, the ESR's goal is not only to deal with Sora Mukujima, but also to destroy his parents, the guild's founders. And this must be done to all of them at once, in a single strike. The monk told Sora's parents everything and advised the boy to come to the command center and meet with Ms. Tonosaki there. Yukio knew this woman well and was certain she would protect Sora and prevent others from using him. They also needed to check the cursing formation. If a battle broke out, even Tiger Roar wouldn't be able to do anything while it was active. Miss Mukajima asked her son not to worry too much, since the guild was based in this very place for a reason. A few minutes later, the monk sat down on the street to meditate. He was focused and alert. Nothing had happened yet, but Yukio already knew they were here. And indeed, at that moment, dark energy spread throughout the courtyard. The courtyard door swung open, and 4 ESRs exuding death appeared in the doorway. The monk used the Veil of Golden Bells. With its help, he began to hold back the villain's advance. But the Ezras were too strong. There were over 100 of them, and they all had a single goal. Even the monk was deeply alarmed when he realized just how many Ezras had arrived. That wasn't all, because soon the Ezras parted and let through their boss, who entered the courtyard, hands in his pockets, confident in himself. Because Richt Mukai himself had come here in person, Mukai ordered one of the Ezras to launch an attack, and already Shirai had stepped forward and directed his power. The representatives of the Union Guild didn't yet understand what was happening, but the guild leader felt as if a dark force were caressing his face. The monk realized that things were very bad. All members of the Union Guild and even the cover squad had been taken over by an evil spirit. They were all trapped and had no way of escaping. And the unexpected guests scanned absolutely everyone present with their scanning eyes, and it was clear that the forces were unequal. The monk addressed the uninvited guests and asked what business had brought them to this house in the middle of the night. Ezra had already realized that their main target, Sora Mukajima, wasn't there, and now they wanted to know where he was. The monk told him not to be rude and suggested that the uninvited guests lacked manners and that he could teach them some. Taking advantage of the pause, Ms. Yu Mukajima immediately began to activate a protective barrier, hoping it would shield her and her family. Soon, the unexpected guests were struck by a debilitating curse that spread over them like a thick fog. The Ezras received a warning about this curse, and it angered them even more. Hiro was very annoyed, but he believed that even if someone from this guild had cursed him, he could still wipe them all out single-handedly. Monk Yukio grabbed the attacking Ezra's fist with his hand and held back the attack, much to the insolent man's surprise. The monk demanded that the ESR stop underestimating the Union Guild. Hiro was very surprised and shocked when he checked his stats and realized that his level had dropped by 30 points. He had become weaker than this arrogant and self-assured SR, who now had nothing to oppose him, having lost his level. And now the monk had launched an offensive move, and Hiro the ESR was forced to fly across the entire courtyard. Everyone within the curse's range lost half of their caster level. Simply put, their levels had dropped by 34 points, and now they had to consider whether they were ready to fight in that state. Rich Mukai was absolutely thrilled. He thought this made things even more interesting, since lately all their battles had been pointless due to the huge difference in levels. And now finally they had a chance to prove themselves, and Rima stepped in. She began to activate her abilities. And Rich Mukai declared that as long as everyone present was in his hands, Sora would crawl to him on his knees, and this amused him greatly. The space in the courtyard began to twitch and blur, and unfortunately, no one from the Union Guild was able to stop this process. And in the very next moment, they all found themselves in the arena of Athena. Rich Mukai was very pleased. He said he hadn't had a fair fight in a long time, and now it even excited him, so he hoped he wouldn't get bored until Sora joined them. The guild members couldn't figure out where their boss, his wife, and his closest aides had gone. But Rich Mukai had already drawn his weapon and said that he would personally eliminate all those annoying obstacles that remained in the courtyard. Meanwhile, the soldiers continued to search the city streets, the part where monsters might appear, gradually eliminating them. Suddenly, their attention was drawn to an object approaching them at tremendous speed. A few moments later, the young man landed near Ms. Tonosaki, and all the soldiers, startled, gaped at the stranger. Sora compared the photo of Miss Tonosaki to make sure he had found the very woman Monk Yukio had recommended to him. After that, the young man raised his hands and said that he had come from the Union Guild and required the military's protection. Ms. Tonosaki ordered the soldiers to lower their weapons. She realized that Sora Mukajima was standing before her and said she had a few questions for him. Meanwhile, in the arena of Athena, Sora's closest companions had no idea what to expect from the unfolding events. Soon, flames ignited on all the columns, signaling that the arena was ready for the battles. Rima turned to the great gods and called upon them to witness her battle. After that, the girl asked the gods to grant her miraculous divine power, which would later help her in battle. And then above all the Ezras, the silhouette of the goddess appeared, She spread her arms and thus protected all the Ezras. Rimu announced the rules. Each side must choose 5 representatives. The team that is the first to achieve 3 victories will receive the blessing of Olympus. The losers would be incinerated by divine light and scattered to the winds. Hiro was very pleased, sensing his victory. Mr. Mukajima asked what it meant that they had to find 5 representatives when there were only 8 of them here. Rimu confirmed that this was indeed the case, but that wasn't all. The fact was that the main star of the show, for whom everyone had gathered in the arena, was still on his way. He simply didn't know he was supposed to show up here. So, with no desire to delay any longer, Hiro stepped forward and asked which of those present was the first to be ready to face death. Thus, Hiro's challenge to his rivals was officially issued, and according to the rules, they must now respond. Monk Yukio was very upset. He believed that because he had allowed himself to think superficially, they had all ended up in this mess. Sakui tried to calm and support his friend, saying that it wasn't the monk's fault. Besides, they were all in the same boat now. The curse cast by Yu had lowered their levels, so for the time being there was a chance to fight one-on-one. Jiro pointed out that Lady Yu was unfit for battle, so the 3 of them would have to handle it and win. The monk knew that Ares' ESR was the strongest among them. After becoming an ESR, he single-handedly defeated an entire guild of 3 Essers, taking advantage of Ares' superior skills. But Yukio asked his friends not to worry because he had a plan he wanted to try. And now the monk volunteered to be the first to fight in this duel to test his tactics. Thus, the monk Yukio Shuzenji stepped into the arena and accepted the challenge to begin the duel. The goddess raised her hand and called on the combatants to prepare for the start of the battle. As soon as the goddess gave the signal to begin the duel, Hiro immediately rushed to attack the monk, who was still standing calmly. Hiro couldn't stand monks or those who loved to talk, so he thrust his hand forward to shut his opponent's mouth. Everyone watched the duel with bated breath as the 2 combatants fought an even match, and no one could tell who would emerge victorious. The monk tried to dodge the direct blows, while Hiro believed that this religious man was only capable of running away and fleeing for his life. At one point, he once again grabbed Hiro's arm, clamping it in his grip and preventing him from launching an attack. Shirai noticed that their comrade had initially closed the distance with his opponent, but was now pulling back. It was clear that the fight wasn't as easy for Hiro as he thought. Rimu knew her comrade wasn't weak, and she didn't want to count Hiro out just yet. Mr. Mukajima asked his comrade how he was feeling. The monk didn't answer, but his hand was badly injured and blood was flowing onto the ground. Hiro was very pleased. He asked how the monk rated Cadmus's fangs and pointed to the sharp teeth protruding from his hand. It was those very fangs that had pierced and wounded the monk's hand. The monk knew that Cadmus was Ares' serpent. He would never have thought that the serpent would possess the Ezra's body to help him in close combat. But now it was clear that Hiro would not hide his host, and sharp spines of the Cadmus serpent appeared all over the Ezra's body. Hiro said that the serpent hadn't had its fill yet, so the attack continued, and he closed in on the monk again at tremendous speed. The monk managed to dodge by making a very quick sidestep, and Hiro's hand whizzed past his face. The situation was complicated by the fact that the Cadmus serpent was already acting on its own. It had partially emerged from Hiro's body and was personally attacking, biting the monk. Yukio used a veil of golden bells to at least slightly hinder the attack of the fanged snake tearing into his flesh. After that, the monk managed to leap back a considerable distance and free his hands from the snake's jaws. However, the next trouble was just around the corner. The venom of the Cadmus snake began to affect the monk's body, and all his stats immediately dropped as a result of the poisoning. Hiro was very pleased with the fight. He noted that the monk turned out to be quite tough, and the battle had become more interesting. Hiro had restored his health thanks to the blood the snake had sucked from the monk, and now he realized that the monk had reached his limit. The guild leader understood as well. If the battle dragged on, the gap in strength would only widen, and it was unclear whether Yukio could handle it. And Hiro had already rushed back into the attack, not giving his opponent a chance to recover. And thanks to the monk's slowed reactions from the poison, Hiro carried out his attack with little difficulty. He landed blow after blow, while the monk could only hide behind his hands, and the only question was how long he could hold out. Yukio, gritting his teeth, began reciting some kind of prayer, because there was nothing else he could do. Hiro was enjoying the fight, but said that no god could help the monk now. Rimu, who was watching the fight closely, noticed that her companion was enveloped in divine power. It was very strange since the monk wasn't an Ezram. Where on earth was his divine power coming from? The guildmaster was absolutely thrilled, watching as his comrade found a good solution in such a difficult situation. It was now clear that this match was still up for grabs, and the monk continued to mutter prayers under his breath, bowing before the embodiment of all Buddhas. And at some point, the Vajra mantra of 100 verses was recited, and now it was fighting in the monk's place. Hiro said he didn't give a damn about any god, and the monk was mistaken if he thought this pathetic trick could stop him. But Yukio was already filled with divine power, which grew stronger and more powerful with every passing moment. Hiro thought the monk was a real idiot, trying to even the odds by donning armor made of divine power. Of course, Hiro respected his opponent's determination, but was that really his entire plan for victory? Hiro had already killed many people, and he had encountered all sorts of characters, even some rather unusual ones. They believed they could block the snake's fangs by covering themselves with a shield of divine power. But they didn't know that divine power was a resource even richer than fresh blood. And now Hiro was certain that he would devour the monk along with his divine power, for he had done so before with another religious figure. And finally, the opponents closed in on each other, and the fight entered its decisive stage. And to the surprise of everyone present, Hiro took a blow to the face, and then the monk sent him flying with a powerful punch to the jaw. Hiro couldn't understand how this could have happened. The monk had managed to suppress the snake's venom and regain his speed using divine power. Yukio had no intention of stopping. He continued his attack and landed several more blows on his opponent. It was now clear that not only his speed, but also his strength and reflexes had increased. Absolutely all his attributes. However, one shouldn't forget about the snake, which was ready to defend its master, and now this monk was the perfect prey for it. Hiro turned to his opponent and said that perhaps they'd fought enough, and the monk should just let the snake devour him. Hiro watched as the snake devoured the divine power and tried to feed on it, and now that divine power would become a part of Hiro. But suddenly something powerful struck the center of Ezra's back, and he couldn't understand what it was or what was happening. Hiro felt that he was no longer in control of the divine power, and now it filled his entire body and was gradually consuming the Ezra. Monk Yukio turned to his opponent and said that it seemed Hiro had started celebrating and having fun too soon. But in reality, carrying this burden was very difficult, especially when it wouldn't obey him. And a new powerful blow struck Hiro in the face. Ezra couldn't believe his ears or the monk's claims that the divine power was too much for the Cadmus serpent to handle. However, the monk smiled, looked at his opponent, and asked where Hiro had gotten the idea that it was divine power. A few more powerful blows to the naive fool, and now he was flying across the entire arena, unable to stay on his feet. Lady Yu now understood why, many years ago, the monk had wanted to be reclassified as an Arhat. Hiro got up from the ground. He felt that he didn't have enough divine power left even to simply maintain the form of a snake. But if the situation had reached such a dead end, he had to take a risk and go for all or nothing. After that, the snake that had been hidden within the Ezra's body suddenly exploded, scattering into pieces in all directions. A terrifying poison was released from it, filling the entire arena, and it was very dangerous for the monk. Jiro soon realized that the drums had begun to beat, and the guildmaster could not believe his eyes. What was happening? Hiro turned to the god lord Ares and said that he was offering him the blood of the poisonous snake as a sacrifice. In return, his beloved disciple asked the god Ares to grant him a spear. And indeed, in the very next moment, a powerful spear appeared in Hiro's hand, with which he intended to fight until his body decayed. Rimu was very alarmed upon seeing the divine weapon. Even an ESR could not use it without offering the god a suitable sacrifice, and even then only temporarily. This weapon carries the power of the god and adapts to the combatant Esser. Shirai had said that this was the insurmountable difference between a player and an ESR. It was now clear that for the monk Shuzengi, this duel was over. But Rimu knew that Hiro had just offered as a sacrifice the poisoned blood of the snake that Ares himself had given him. If the gods discover this deception, they will be enraged. However, Ares is merciful, and he will forgive Hiro for the victory. Yet in the event of defeat, it is terrifying to even imagine what fate awaits Hiro. Rimu didn't want to believe in defeat. She hoped that an ESR who had mastered a divine weapon could never lose to a mere player. The monk noted with horror that his opponent was closing in again. He stared intently at Hiro and couldn't figure out where the spear that had just been in his hand had gone. Yukio assumed that he simply couldn't see the spear. He managed to dodge, but a powerful explosion still rang out right behind him. The monk realized he was lucky and had avoided the blow thanks to a timely mantra. Although he had taken damage, He hoped the spear wasn't poisonous like a snake. It became clear that the spear had a destructive effect, and the monk lost half of his armor's defensive properties. And the enemy attacked again, and in addition to hand-to-hand combat, he also fired arrows from his back. The monk realized that the opponent not only fired a spear from his fist, but could also do so with other parts of his body. The speed of the strike was simply insane. Hiro was enjoying his physical condition and wanted to see what the monk would do with all of this now. Yukio wasn't even trying to think anymore. He was just hoping to dodge because he couldn't read the attack at all or predict where it was going. On top of that, every missed blow weakened the player further, and his opponent was still very strong even after taking karmic damage. The monk realized that if Hiro hadn't been weakened beforehand by the curse, he would already be dead. Be that as it may, he needed to try to keep his distance. That would make it easier to dodge the next attacks. Yukio began chanting the mantra again to cast the divine sign. He was trying to purify all three realms so that strife and sin would vanish. Hiro, meanwhile, was gloating. He could see that his opponent was trying to increase the distance, hoping that it would help. The monk activated the Silent Sutra, and now a divine light appeared above his opponent. The Silent Sutra embodied holiness that purified and banished impure forces, which reduced the effectiveness of the poisonous snake's blood. Hiro realized that his opponent wanted to restrict his movement and gain an advantage through distance, but he was certain that these were naive dreams. Mr. Mukajima shouted to his friend to be careful. At that moment, another attack rained down on the monk, and he barely managed to dodge it. Several sharp spears pierced his hat. The goddess presiding over the duel turned to Mr. Mukajima with utter indignation. She declared that interference in a duel held in the arena was unacceptable. One must not give hints or intervene. And after that, the goddess unleashed fire upon the rule breaker, and now the guildmaster was engulfed in flames. His wife, Lady Yu, immediately began using healing techniques to extinguish the fire and alleviate his condition. The divine fire disappeared very quickly, but it had sapped the man's vitality, and that was very bad. Hiro looked at his rival and said that he would already be dead if the guildmaster hadn't intervened. But it was no big deal. He could land another serious blow. Besides, Hiro understood that the rule breaker would face punishment, and that was very beneficial for all the Essers. Monk Yukio realized that close combat was already too risky. The opponent had long-range blood harpoons in his arsenal. Given the monk's remaining strength, he could hold out for a maximum of 3 minutes, but he had to fight to the end. He had no choice. Hiro wanted to end the fight as quickly as possible. He was already thoroughly fed up with all of this, and now he was preparing for the final critical strike. ESR was confident of victory, and a new wave of attacks was directed at the monk. Yukio called upon all the dharmas to become one. The fact is that all arhats are divided into ranks: the heavenly eye, the wise eye, the eye of the Dharma, and the eye of the Buddha. If he cannot win as the wise eye, then let the eye of the Dharma open. The eye of the Dharma significantly accelerates perception, but it lasts only a very short time. So the monk needed to find a way to break through quickly. Yukio realized that his opponent's spear didn't possess all that much divine power. Yukio braced himself for the attack, gathered his strength, and intercepted the divine spear with his bare hands. Hiro was very surprised. He was pressing down on the spear with both hands, but it didn't budge at all. Moreover, the monk realized exactly how the attack would unfold. The monk was now smiling and said that he had grasped the essence of the bloody spears his opponent had been thrusting at him. It all turned out to be unexpectedly simple. Shirai couldn't believe his eyes. How had this monk managed to block the finest threads of blood? Rimu watched the monk's eyes closely and realized that they were capable of seeing right through the technique. The guild leader and his deputy cheered up a little when they saw that the duel wasn't lost yet. It was simply amazing. Their fellow monk had found a way to counter the Esru of the god Ares himself. Yukio noted that the amount of negative energy accumulated within his opponent was giving rise to unholy thoughts. The monk said he would purge every last drop of impurity and began to cast a purifying mantra. Soon, Yukio could already feel that all the blood touched by his divine power was yielding to his control without resistance. Rimu knew that the divine power in the blood was not uniform and was still not as straightforward as it might seem. Given that the blood was so subtle, it was capable of piercing an enemy's defenses at the very moment they least expected it. And indeed, the monk, absorbed in purifying his blood, soon noticed that the poison blood was gradually gathering around him for a future attack. He had absolutely nowhere to run because the blood needles were aimed at him from all sides. The monk again used the Eye of Dharma to examine the entire technique before it could take effect on him. And then the purifying sutras of divine power purified all of Ezra's blood, and he found himself powerless. Yukio continued to pray, while the blood arrows flew toward him regardless. All beings dwelling in the darkness of ignorance, bound by passions, will fall into the three evil paths, finding only endless suffering. At that moment, Rimu began to advise her companion, saying that all of Hiro's attacks were pointless because the monk could see the movement of divine power. Hiro was outraged because the goddess Athena, who was watching the duel, did not punish Rimu, but merely gave her a warning. But Mr. Mukajima stopped his companion, saying they shouldn't interfere. They'd be better off waiting for Yukio Shuzengi's victory. Divine power continued to press down on Hiro, and he could barely stand, yet he was furious, unwilling to manage without his girlfriend's hints. Soon, a massive sacred form loomed behind the monk, and his sutra continued to work as before. Hiro was losing control of his body more and more, because the divine light was completely destroying all the negativity within him. May he appear before us, overcoming obstacles and grant peace while the suffering whisper his name. This was precisely the sutra that all monks learn first. But that doesn't mean it's weak. On the contrary, the power of the wrathful guardian deity, like all offensive and defensive forces, is doubled. However, this effect lasts only 30 seconds. And during this period, one must not be distracted or lose concentration for even a moment. One must continue reciting the sutra directly in front of the enemy. An incredible humiliation. Despite his physical wounds and injuries, Hiro tore his own shoulders open with his bare hands and let the blood flow. That blood was immediately directed at the monk to attack him at any cost, just so he would interrupt the sutra. Yukio knew that the spell was capable of suppressing the snake's blood, and attempting to overcome this block required an enormous amount of divine power. Such an unexpected attack is utterly meaningless in the eyes of the Dharma. It wouldn't even scratch the monk. And Hiro continued to tear at his own body, flooding everything around him with blood and directing it like a weapon at his opponent. He kept going, and it was clear that Hiro was no longer in control of anything. He was like a crazed monster, thirsting for victory. Yukio could barely stand. He too was at his limit, and blood was streaming from his eyes, but he had to hold on, even though time was running out. Hiro was furious that he didn't even have enough strength to break the monk's concentration. A massive guardian deity towered over the arena, while Hiro could no longer rise, kneeling before his opponent. The final countdown began, and the power of prayer, like the virtue of a small child, like burning ice doused in oil, like water flowing through the heart of a tree. And now everything converges in Yukio's mind like a supreme deity, and the decisive blow comes. It crashed down on Hiro, who could offer no resistance to this divine power. Yukio managed to think that he had, after all, finished off his opponent before the Eye of Dharma reached its limit. The goddess presiding over the arena announced that the first match went to the Union Guild. Yukio Shusenji had won the match, but the boy could barely stand, and blood was streaming down his face. However, that didn't matter anymore. Rimu immediately began casting healing spells on her comrade, who couldn't even get up off the floor. Soon, Hiro was physically healed, but he continued to sit silently, lost in thought. Suddenly, two gods appeared behind him, who apparently were dissatisfied with their Esram. They looked at Hiro, and the very sight of this place, where the hypocritical Athena had held a duel, and he had managed to lose in such a place, made them sick. The guys didn't want to hear any excuses. They said their father had sent him a message and asked them to tell him that he was deeply disappointed in Hiro. And the boys said that Hiro had been granted the honor of receiving punishment at their hands, and now they would carry it out. The rods and the sword of Damocles came down on the Ezra, who could do nothing and was now being punished. Mr. Mukajima was very surprised when he realized how these gods treated their Ezras. At that moment, the gods told the young man that this was their father's final act of mercy, said goodbye to him, and vanished. His friends congratulated the monk on his victory. He had held his own with great dignity, despite the fact that the duel had been a serious one. Hiro declared that next time he would definitely kill the monk, but Shiraya replied that there would be no next time. The thing is, now he, Shiraya, would be the one to fight, and all opponents would be burned alive in the all-consuming flames of Ada. Sakui Mukajima looked at this terrifying Ezra and said he would take him on. His wife handed him a small pouch and said that her husband was going up against the Reaper himself, who was capable of summoning spirits, and that this would definitely help. Sakui thanked his wife for the item and placed it in his inventory, knowing that it would surely come in handy. And now the leader had entered the arena, where Shiraya awaited him with a huge scythe in his hands. As a samurai, Sakui could project the aura of his blade to keep the enemy at bay, but it takes time to build up the charge. Still, in one-on-one battles, close combat is the best solution. First, you need to close the distance with a quick step. Then you need to unleash a series of quick strikes on the opponent before they can react. Next, you need to find your opponent's weakness and deliver the finishing blow. Of course, this tactic is fairly straightforward, but at the same time it is very effective and quite capable of working. At that moment, the goddess Athena called on the opponents to prepare and announced the start of the duel. Shiraya immediately unleashed his spirits on the opponent, but the leader decided he could slip between them using a speed step and analyze all their movements. In the very next moment, Sakui was standing behind the Ezra, preparing to strike him. While Shiraya was confident that his spirits were sufficient, Sakui sliced through his opponent with his sword. But it turned out to be an illusion, because there were no bodies torn to pieces. However, in the next instant, a huge number of spirits were already surrounding the man from all sides. Sakui wielded his sword at tremendous speed and managed to cut through the attacking spirits. And now he broke free from their grasp and stood before his opponent. A new powerful strike split Shirai's body in two, and everyone could clearly see him split into two halves. But it soon became clear that this tactic was useless. The man's attacks could not harm someone who had no physical form. Mr. Mukajima seemed not to be listening to his opponent at all. He continued to split his body in half again and again. Shirai mocked the man and said that all these attempts were completely pointless. He should just admit defeat. Shirai said that he had an unimaginable number of vengeful spirits at his disposal, and his opponent would never reach Shirai and wouldn't even be able to cut them all down. The problem was that a samurai who couldn't see his opponent was completely useless. Mr. Mukajima was just about to launch a sword attack, but at that moment Shirai closed in on him and said he wouldn't give him a chance to charge his sword with aura. Sakui swung his sword non-stop at tremendous speed, fending off the spirits before they could harm him. Rimu watched the duel, and now she saw that the battle was more like a fight between an ordinary person and an Esram. Hiro thought his comrade had simply gotten lucky and drawn a weak opponent, but Rimu knew that it was very difficult for a samurai to lead a guild, which meant that Sakui was very strong and unique in his own way. Mrs. Yu calmly watched her husband's duel, and it seemed as though she wasn't doing anything. She wasn't nervous or excited. Rimu noticed the woman, who was far too relaxed for a situation where her husband might get hurt, which meant they had another ace up their sleeve. This time, Sakui once again cut the demons to pieces, and everything around them was in shreds. The samurai was deeply focused. Though he was fighting desperately, he was still safe and sound for the moment. His opponent sent another wave of spirits at the samurai, so that the man wouldn't even have time to catch his breath. But completely out of the blue, the samurai executed an eightfold leap, scattering all the spirits along the way, and now he was right behind his opponent. When the sixth refuge first appeared, the soldiers and players joined forces to search for monster nests. Near the sixth refuge, they discovered a mine from which monsters crawled out nonstop. Later, it became the first research base. At first, the monsters were small and weak, so progress was easy, and even the soldiers handled them without any trouble. But gradually, people began to venture deeper into the mine, exploring it and encountering new monsters along the way. And there, the situation had already changed. The mine was home to completely different types of monsters, and their numbers were limitless. These monsters also had different ranks, and now the people had to fight simultaneously, using various skills and abilities. Inside the cave was an entire ecosystem of monsters, as if it were their hidden nest, where they bred their own kind, lived, and evolved. Deep within this mine, a spider had made its home, and it was at level 80. At that time, it was the most terrifying creature. Moreover, people in those days had no abilities or weapons that could be used against such a monster, so it was decided to flee from this beast. Saki Mukajima drew the monster's attention to himself. He rushed toward the spider so that the others could escape from the mine. Everyone saw how this brave samurai, sword in hand, rushed to attack the terrifying monster, but no one knew what happened next. 3 days had passed since then, and suddenly a desperate scream from the defeated monster echoed through the cave. The people watched the cave with bated breath, and as if in response to the spider's cry, the cave began to collapse, and before the people's eyes, huge boulders fell, blocking the entrance to the cave from within. And at the very last moment, pushing off from the falling rocks, Sakui Mukajima leaped out of the cave. The man was alive and well, and held his sword in his hands. That time, he had used a technique called the Eightfold Leap, and now that technique was being used again against Ezra Shirai. The samurai cut down his opponent, but as was customary, it was not a body, but merely a spirit, and it became clear that this terrifying technique allowed him to perform 8 consecutive leaps, each faster than the last. But it hadn't had any effect on the battle yet. Sakui had already used this method 3 times to evade the vengeful spirits. The next moment, the samurai used this skill once more. Shirai was stunned that his opponent was getting faster and faster. The 5th use of the skill led the samurai to find his opponent and bring his sword down upon him. Sakui was forced to cut down the spirits again and again, all of which he did with the power he had inherited from the great hero. And now that there were no spirits nearby, he could use his speed to his advantage and cut down his opponent before new spirits had time to form. So far, Sakui was doing everything as planned. He calculated that if he used his speed to outrun his opponent, the man simply wouldn't have time to recreate the spirits, and the battle would turn into close combat. In close combat, the samurai knew he was capable of winning, and now he held his sword in his hands and activated the hero's legacy. Rimu now fully understood why the samurai had held the position of guild leader for so long. Even though he wasn't an Esram, with such power he could easily match most of the guild. There were many theories about how the tower came to be. The most widespread theory was that the tower was a fusion of human history and mythology into a single whole. In this picture, history and myths are inseparable, and the gods from myths are contrasted with heroes from history. But becoming a chosen one of the gods or the heir of a hero are 2 completely different things. To become a chosen one of a god, one must fight, while the hero's legacy is more akin to destiny. And now these 2 have clashed in close combat so that their gods and heroes can show which of them is the master. Shiraya didn't believe that this samurai actually hoped to win in close combat, for a mortal's weapon is no match for the Reaper's scythe. Of course, the Reaper's scythe was a terrifying weapon. In terms of range and reach, it had a clear advantage. But still, considering that the scythe is a divine artifact, it wouldn't be so easy for a human to handle it. If Shiraya uses the scythe as a conventional weapon, making wide swings to strike from a distance, then this must be exploited. This could create a vulnerability because it gives you the chance to close in on the enemy the moment his weapon is raised above his head. It seems the gods didn't teach Shirai how to use the scythe properly and safely, and now the samurai has pierced his body with his sword. Sakui said that he had originally planned to use this skill to dodge in case of danger, but this time his leap didn't even come in handy. The guildmaster and the monk were ecstatic. They shouted that it was all over and victory was theirs. However, Lady Yu wasn't quite so optimistic. She said it was far from over. Despite the sword sticking out of his chest, having pierced right through his body, Shirai didn't look like he was dying. He said that his happy face was literally infuriating. The man didn't understand what was happening. Had he really missed? And had the spirits been summoned and created again? But the opponent began to laugh merrily. He didn't understand why the samurai thought he could only move between phantom bodies. And in the very next moment, the ESR delivered a powerful blow, and the samurai was forced to fly off to the side because he could offer no resistance. Sakui immediately got back on his feet and prepared to defend himself. But the man immediately received a warning that he was marked with Ada's enemy seal. The samurai realized he had been careless. But it turned out that his opponent was capable of giving his own body the form of a spirit, which ruled out any physical damage. Shiraya declared that if he landed 4 attacks on his opponent, the samurai would become his spirit slave. Shiraya realized that his opponent was quite serious, and now he was going to fight with all his might and show no mercy. The 1st degree seal of Hades currently on the samurai indicated that as soon as the seal reached the 4th degree, he would become a vengeful spirit of Hades. The samurai knew that if he closed in on his opponent, he risked receiving another seal. And if the samurai kept his distance, he would give Shirai time to spawn new spirits. The situation was dire either way. Of course, an 8-fold leap would have come in handy now, but unfortunately, it was on cooldown. Shiraya turned to the samurai and said that he acknowledged Mr. Mukajima was indeed very talented, but in the end, he was still just one of many ordinary mediocre people. Shiraya launched an attack on his opponent. His immaterial form continuously absorbed mana, and the incoming magical damage was increased at that moment, but in return, he remained invulnerable to physical attacks. Saki prepared to fend off the spirits, maneuvering very quickly and changing his position. ESR could see that his opponent was a very fast man, But at the same time, it was clear that he had already lost his edge and couldn't maintain a high level of performance for long. The scythe swept right past his arm, where there was now a fresh wound, and a second-degree seal of Hades appeared. As soon as it reached the fourth degree, the man would become a vengeful spirit of Hades. Shiraya understood that his opponent would not be able to run for long. As soon as all four marks were present, the body would burn in hellfire, rot, and fall apart. The bones would wither, crumble, and turn to dust. In the end, the samurai's soul would be bound, and he would become just another little dog in Shiraya's service. Isar continued his attacks, and though he took his time, everything around him was still under his influence. Shiraya felt increasingly confident. Another attack was completed, and now the samurai's body had received the third seal of Ida, and soon he would join the ranks of Shiraya's shadows and servants. Sakuai used the eightfold leap again, and once more sliced his opponent in two, but it was all completely useless, because the ESR took no damage on a physical level. Shiraya realized that his opponent was deliberately stalling for time so that the ESR's mana would run out and he would lose his immaterial form. Of course, it was a decent idea and tactic, but it still wouldn't work. Shiraya knew he could maintain this form for at least another 3 minutes. But unfortunately, that was too little time for the samurai. There was only one seal left to cast, and he was busy charging his sword and leaving himself wide open. Shiraya crept up from behind, using a phantom shadow, raised his scythe above the samurai's head, and declared that it was time for him to become a vengeful spirit. And now Shiraya is ready to strike. He sees the sword before him, but knows that the sword's aura is material and cannot reach the Ezra. Mrs. Yu gave her husband an object in a small bag that could summon spirits and was supposed to help. Mukajima had been saving this object for the very last moment, and now he used it. This amulet had been soaked in holy water from the temple, dried in the sun, and imbued with the priest's divine power. The object was created to exorcise spirits and to create an aura around physical objects. And now the use of this item proved to be the most effective way for the samurai to strike his opponent. Rimu realized that not only had her companion prepared trump cards against the samurai, but these people had also prepared their own unexpected surprises. Sakui struck with his sword, but Shirai was certain it was already too late. He laughed loudly and said that the fourth seal had already been engraved. Hellfire began to consume the samurai, and soon he would turn into a spirit. Shiraya turned to the samurai and demanded that he submit to him right now. The master clutched his sword tightly in his hands. It was filled with a divine aura, and the shadow's influence prevented him from passing into the spirit world. Suddenly, it became clear that the samurai's mind was clearing, and he said that Shiraya should not get his hopes up and calmly wait for him to pass into the shadows. And now, unfortunately for his opponent, the samurai's body was becoming lighter, which meant that movement and attacks came more easily to him. Shiraya couldn't believe his eyes. After all, his opponent should have already used all his countermeasures against spirits, yet he kept closing in as if his reserves of strength were limitless. Moreover, the samurai was no longer using the cooldown to activate the eightfold leap. He was slicing through the spirits and continuing to advance. Mr. Mukajima told his opponent that even if Shiraya had figured everything out, it was already too late to stop him. The next moment, the samurai found himself behind his opponent once again, ready to cut him in half once more. Sakui delivered powerful and rapid strikes and said that until he turned into a vengeful spirit, he would continue his attacks. And in the end, before becoming a spirit, the samurai would kill Shirai, and now he was behind him again, bringing down a sword strike. Shiraya no longer looked so confident, but still, did this samurai really think he was incapable of blocking his strikes? But as it turned out, the samurai had decided to strike him until Shiraya died. And so it happened. Victory once again went to the Union Guild, and Rich Mukai stood over the body of his Ezra. The guild leader said that Shiraya had turned out to be nothing but a disgrace among all the Ezras. He hadn't expected this at all. Rich Mukai was already tired of entertaining himself in this arena. He was waiting for his son to appear and come save his parents, while Sora was racing off somewhere at full speed, leaping over the rooftops. Jiro was very pleased with his boss's victory. He had won, which meant everything was fine. But the monk believed that in reality everything was bad, because the dark energy was growing denser and denser. And this dark energy was nothing like what they had seen before. Shirai lay defeated on the ground, dark energy swirling around him, and he prayed that there was nothing like that here, because he didn't want to go through it again. Suddenly, a crack appeared in Shirai's back, and what looked like bony fingers began to emerge from it. They gradually pushed the flesh aside, and before long, a necromancer appeared before everyone, declaring that Shirai was nothing but a pathetic and shameful little man. Mukajima couldn't believe his eyes. He had never seen anything like this, and had no idea what kind of monstrosity it was. Shiraya, of whom only the head remained, begged for forgiveness and pleaded for another chance. But the strange creature said that cheap tricks wouldn't win the fight. Strength is a very important factor in battle. The necromancer clamped his hand around Shirai's head and crushed it like a tomato, sending blood spattering in all directions. He declared that not only Shirai, but his enemies as well, would not escape from here alive. The samurai surmised that he was now facing the true form of the Ezra of Ada. It was all eerie and terrifying. No one knew what kind of monster this was, but everyone understood that it was a very dangerous and bloodthirsty creature. Rist Mukai, however, looked pleased. He understood that the duel was about to take a different turn, and now everything would be different. The enormous demonic ESR of Ada towered over the arena, and it was completely unclear from which side to approach him. ESR recounted that the first person he killed after becoming an Esser was his own brother. This had happened many years ago, and since then, the monster had lost count of his victims. As soon as someone died by his hand, they immediately became his personal puppet. And now the true Ezra of Ida was certain that exactly the same fate awaited the samurai. The man had a first-degree seal on his head. He had believed that after Shirai's death, everything would be reset. But for some reason, that hadn't happened. The Eightfold Leap was still recharging, and the man had run out of options. He felt a terrible sense of hopelessness. But this feeling was familiar to the samurai. He had experienced exactly the same sensations when he was left alone against the giant spider. To give the people a chance to escape, Sakui Mukajima drew the monster's attention. Even though he had absolutely no idea what to do, he could only dodge the giant monster's attacks. He had to keep doing this until everyone had a chance to escape. He couldn't give up or retreat. The enormous monster could harm the people, and it was necessary to draw its attention to give them at least some chance to escape. Sakui was approaching the giant spider, but he realized he wouldn't make it in time, and the giant monster was about to start crushing people. He had to draw its attention immediately. But it was very difficult to achieve anything with simple attacks, and besides, it was unclear where this giant's weak spot was. Even a sword stuck in its head did it no harm. And so, unable to think of anything else, the samurai hurled his sword, which spun through the air like a shuriken. The sword struck the spider at tremendous speed, which of course, the spider did not like at all, and it rushed after its attacker. This was exactly what the samurai had been counting on. He ran and leaped, using his ability to jump from place to place, dragging the giant spider along behind him. Mukajima was completely dissatisfied with his abilities, but at the same time he saw that the people had taken advantage of the situation and had the opportunity to leave the cave, which meant that the main goal had been achieved. Of course, if the samurai had been stronger, he could have achieved more, and things would have turned out differently. But suddenly, a hero appeared beside the man, urging him not to give up, then picked him up and carried him away from the spider. The hero said he had come to save the man. He was a legendary warrior who had trained the great ones, but now he was saving an ordinary samurai. And at that moment, Sakui realized that not only monsters had come to this world, but also legendary heroes who could offer help in the most unexpected situations. And the mythical warrior carried the samurai deep into the mine and laid him on the ground. Sakui thanked him for the rescue and asked who he was. The legendary warrior asked to be called Karasutengu and told his story. At the behest of his fallen comrade, the warrior had been searching for someone worthy to inherit the blade that slays spiders, as well as the will of his former master. It was in this very cave that the demonic spider, the very creature this sword was designed and forged to combat, was found. The legendary warrior explained that the monster instinctively fears this blade, which is why it attacks the warrior. The warrior admitted that while he could plunge the blade into the spider's head, he couldn't kill it, thus creating a vicious cycle for the two of them. And then the warrior saw a desperate samurai who had entered the battle to protect people he barely knew, and a brilliant idea struck the legendary warrior. The samurai is capable of breaking the vicious cycle. Apparently, only he has the strength to defeat the spider and take his fallen comrade's sword for himself. Sakui shook hands with the legendary warrior and said he would be honored to carry out this mission. After that, Karasutengu never left the samurai's side. He gave him private lessons, and thanks to this, Sakui mastered the heroic legacy. Everything was fine, but the man felt he lacked talent. To his regret, he admitted that he could not learn everything the legendary warrior had to offer, and this greatly distressed him. Of the 6 techniques Karasutengu knew, he taught the samurai 3, but that would be enough to defeat the spider if they fought together. The battle against the giant spider monster was extremely grueling. Both warriors fought side by side, trying to inflict maximum damage on the monster. The samurai used the Eightfold Step, one of the 3 skills he had mastered while training under the legendary warrior. And after that, Mukujima was able to quickly close in on the spider and deliver a crushing final blow. After the giant spider was destroyed, the legendary warrior handed him a sword, not just 1 but 3, and upon receiving them, the samurai made a vow. Sakui Mukujima swore, if he ever met someone more worthy, he would pass these blades on and send those people to train under the legendary warrior. It was unclear why the samurai was recalling this story now, as he fought against the shadow attacks directed by Ezra Ada. In truth, the man had never considered himself worthy of these swords. He was merely a temporary keeper and had learned a little about fighting with them. And yet now, using these swords against the demonic force, he thought he might win and hoped that everything would work out for him. Besides, the samurai had nothing to rely on but the power of these swords. And now another blade was in his hands. Saki thought that if he died in this duel, he would never be able to fulfill the promise he had made to the legendary warrior who had saved his life. If only for that reason he had to survive this battle, because a voice inside him told him that the samurai still had unfinished business in this world. His loved ones watched in horror as events unfolded in the arena. They had no idea how they could help their friend. Jiro noticed the sword now in Mukujima's hands. A monster, but even a hero is just a man. Rimu also believed that no heroic weapon could help a man defeat a god. ESR watched his opponent with interest. He was holding his own in the duel and didn't look like a puny little man. At one point, Isar Ada caught himself thinking that he was afraid of the aura emanating from the sword. Something had to be done about this immediately. ESR ordered his puppet warriors to stop this man, to do it all together and immediately. It was very difficult for the samurai to cope with the attacks. He understood that the warrior was using a legendary sword to kill the spider, and most likely, this sword possessed powers capable of suppressing evil. And now, as the samurai attacked the monster, he could see that the creature deeply disliked the sword's influence and aura. Sakui had no idea how effective his sword would be against the god of the underworld, but now everyone who could was attacking the man to prevent him from reaching Ezra. A powerful arrow pierced the samurai's thigh. He hadn't managed to parry the attack and was now seriously wounded. Sakui was confident he could handle his opponent if he poured every last drop of his mana into the sword's aura. Having fully charged his sword, the samurai immediately began to destroy all the attacking forces directed at him at tremendous speed. With every passing moment, the sword's aura grew stronger, and soon everything around him was enveloped by it. Esar, the god of Ada, acknowledged that the samurai looked and behaved with great strength and dignity, but one must not forget that they were not equals. No human should be so arrogant as to think that ordinary human weapons could pierce a god's defenses, and now ESR would dispel these foolish hopes. Suddenly, a loud growing noise began to echo from an unknown source. Everyone present could barely bear the sound. People were literally losing their sense of direction. It felt as though their brains were about to melt. Sakui realized that while he could block his opponent's blows, these sound waves were extremely irritating. The man wasn't going to put up with them and was about to take down his opponent once again. It turned out that the sword in his hands was capable of emitting roar-like waves that restricted his opponent. The samurai saw that the huge ESR was trembling in place because of the rattling sound and was unable to fight actively. He had to take advantage of this opportunity, especially since the ESR of the god Ada himself was surprised that his movement was being restricted by sound waves. However, the ESR believed it was too early for the man to rejoice. The duration of the Sacred Blade's effect was soon immediately reduced. And at the very moment when a person is practically convinced of his victory, absolutely anything can happen, and he can become weaker. Sakui was rapidly closing in on his opponent, realizing he had only one chance. Everyone watched the duel with bated breath, unable to predict whether the samurai would manage to deliver the final blow before the ESR came to. Sakui raised his sword and was already near his opponent's head. It seemed that nothing could stop him now. But at that moment, the ESR shouted loudly and said it was all over. He instantly grabbed the samurai with his hand and squeezed his body like a toy figure. Listening to the samurai's groans, the god of the underworld, Esser, announced with relish that the man's end had come. All three, Lady Yu, the monk, and Jiro, activated their abilities, trying in this way to help Mr. Mukujima, upon whom Esser had instantly placed 4 seals of death. Obviously, no one could just stand by and watch this man's destruction, but the goddess Athena intervened again and said that no one dared to disrupt the duel in the arena. However, unexpectedly, the goddess Athena felt some kind of influence on her body. She stood up straight, as if at attention, and asked who was there. The other Ezras also felt vibrations, as if someone were breaking through the barrier from the outside, but the Lord was supposed to be guarding the perimeter. At that moment, a stream of light poured down from the sky, shattering the protective sphere above the arena. The surprised goddess Athena said nothing more, for she began to crumble on her own. Rimu saw that the barrier had been destroyed. It was simply unreal. Could Lord Zeus have intervened and destroyed the barrier with his lightning? But then everyone realized that the situation had worsened not because of Zeus, but because Sora Mukujima had somehow managed to intervene to save his parents. Rimu realized that the lightning spear Sora had hurled at the protective barrier was a technique known only to the gods. As soon as the protective barrier was breached, Lady Yu and the monk were able to cast defensive spells in the form of a magic shield and a diamond veil to protect Lord Mukujima. The mother shouted at her son to ignore his father and focus on his opponent, and Sora immediately sent a lightning spear at Ezra Ada's face. Ezra hadn't expected this at all. He cursed and swore, staring at his ruined face. He didn't care that this brat had broken through the barrier. It was already too late, and his father had already become a plaything in Ezra Ada's hands. Jiro instantly conjured a stone pedestal, which Sora used to push off for his next attack. Now Sora was rapidly closing in on the hand that was gripping his father. He wanted to destroy it and take the man back to lift the curse from him. Ezra Ida screamed loudly. He couldn't believe his eyes and stared in astonishment at the remnant of his arm. Now he had no hand, and it was completely unclear how this had happened to him. The enormous hand, severed at the elbow, fell to the ground, still clutching the samurai within it. Sora ran to the severed hand, pried open the fingers clutching his father, and lifted the man to help him leave the arena. Sora shouted that he wouldn't let anyone die while he was there. After that, the young man encouraged his father, saying he'd held up great. Sora told his father that this skeleton wasn't a problem at all, but that the guy behind the barrier who shoots lightning was really strong. The young man admitted that this was the strongest opponent he had faced since leaving the abyss. Rishmukai was very pleased, for Sora Mukujima, whom they had been waiting for so long, had finally appeared, and he hurled bolts of lightning. And although these lightning bolts didn't hurt Sora, something still felt strange. It was as if they had passed right through him, and it was unclear what their purpose was. Besides, it was strange how easily the barrier had been destroyed. Sora decided not to dwell on it for now. He carried his father to his friends so they could help the man recover. As for the young man himself, he had to fight the leader of the Esrov, who had deliberately staged this whole circus for his sake. Mukai looked down at the boy from above. A huge dragon stood beside him, and the whole scene looked rather amusing. Hiro had already come to his senses and declared, if the barrier had been destroyed, then they no longer had to worry about the rules established by the goddess Athena. The very next moment, Hiro approached the monk and challenged him to a rematch, unafraid of the rules. Rimu found all this very strange. She noticed that the Lord wasn't stopping Hiro. Perhaps the Lord wanted to gauge Hiro's true strength without any restrictions. And now such an opportunity had arisen. The girl realized she shouldn't stand on the sidelines. She hadn't participated in the fight at all today. However, it wasn't just her. Kaichi was standing there too, as if he'd simply come here to watch a movie and have some fun. The assassin asked her not to worry about him, since he only appeared at the right moments and would definitely join the fight when he deemed it necessary. Rimu called out to Shiraya, saying that he had merely lost an arm, so there was no need to act like he was dying. He needed to get back in the fray and fight everyone. Shiraya was very upset that he had nearly lost this battle, so he wanted revenge and had no intention of sitting on the sidelines. He immediately rushed into the attack, saying that no one would snatch victory from him. The young man asked Jiro to take care of his parents and said he would handle everything else. Jiro, as the master of stone, immediately created a protective barrier around himself and the Mukujima couple to give the leader a chance to recover. Sora stood before the stone barrier and waited for his first opponent to approach. Once he realized his family and loved ones were safe, Sora decided it was time to give it his all. He would kill anyone who laid a finger on his father and mother. Meanwhile, Hiro was fighting the monk. The two exchanged blows, and so far, the duel had been fairly calm. Suddenly, Sora appeared between them, kicking Hiro and sending him flying away from the monk. Hiro was very surprised by the incredible speed this boy had displayed. He immediately summoned his venomous snake and demanded that they stop underestimating him. Sora leaped toward his opponent in a single bound and broke his arm with a kick, shattering the bones into tiny pieces. Hiro flew past his friend at tremendous speed and came to a halt, crashing violently into a stone wall. Rimu realized that her companion wasn't capable of withstanding even a single blow. A real idiot in a chatterbox. Sora asked the monk to do something about these spirits approaching them from all sides, sent by the god Ida's SSS-Rank. The monk immediately began to pray and invoke Nirvana. With the help of sacred light, he bound the spirits together. It soon became clear that the spirits of Shirai were completely powerless and useless against the monk. That's what happens when opponents are poorly matched in terms of their ranks and categories. The girl immediately pulled out her Valkyrie shield and hurled it at the monk, intending to knock him off his feet. However, Sora calmly stopped the flying Valkyrie shield with his hand, catching it as if it were a toy flying saucer. Rima didn't want to fight this monster herself, but now she had no choice. She aimed her sword at Sora. However, he grabbed her arm before she could strike. After that, the young man, though he certainly didn't like to hurt women, knocked the sword out of her hands and struck her face with his shield with all his might. Rimu's face was shattered, her bones broken, and the girl couldn't understand why the Lord was watching this fight and not intervening. Mokai was high in the sky, looking down at his subordinates who had proven to be useless scum. The Lord addressed them, loading his enormous bow with arrows of lightning, and said that his assistants had forgotten they were under a debilitating curse. And now the Lord was about to strike a blow that he dedicated to the wife of the guildmaster, Lady Y. Monk Yukio sensed powerful waves of divine energy and realized that the main villain was aiming at Lady Yu. Something had to be done immediately, and of course it was reckless. But there was no choice left. The monk removed the blindfold. He wanted to activate the Okoderm as soon as possible. The Lord turned to the monk and told him not to even hope for it. He wouldn't give him time to recite the mantra in full. Yukio stared intently at the villain and realized that things were very bad. The next moment, a massive and powerful attack struck the stone protective dome where Sora's parents were hiding. At that moment, Sora was engrossed in the battle. And when the explosion that struck everything around them rang out, the young man could only watch what was happening from the sidelines. That powerful explosion completely destroyed the stone structure in a single blow, and now it was just a pile of rubble, among which he saw a lifeless hand hanging down. Sora rushed toward the hand, realizing it was his mother, buried under the rubble, crushed, and possibly already dead. Before the young man could reach the pile of rocks to dig the woman out, he noticed Valkyrie's shield hurtling toward his head at tremendous speed. The young man was furious, and he struck the shield with all his might so that no one would dare stand in his way. But something was wrong, because the Valkyrie's shield now possessed a completely different power, and the young man felt a sharp pain in his arm. Rima leapt toward the boy. She was now confident in her strength and hoped that Sora wouldn't underestimate her, because the curse of weakness had been lifted. Sora managed to grab the girl's fist and held it with his hand, but the young man felt an incredible force now pressing down on him. Sora realized he couldn't move to push his opponent away, and Rima told the boy that if the curse of weakness hadn't been lifted, it only meant the woman was already dead. Those words infuriated the young man, and he found the strength to shove Rima aside. It was clear that Sora was deeply upset, and his emotions were now getting in the way. And when a person is ruled by emotions, they become the perfect target for attacks and blows. Rima unleashed another attack on the young man, which pierced right through him, and now the bonds began to bind his arms and legs. Sora felt he couldn't break through, and now he was literally stuck in one spot, unable to properly fend off the attack. Rimu activated her scanning eye and saw an incredible sight. Within the boy lay a power that surpassed that of the gods. The most terrifying thing was that inside Sora was a black hole that devoured everything that touched his divine power and transformed it into its own might. Rimu realized that this guy was a true monster, but he was still too weak because he was unable to control his divine power. Rimu now understood why the Lord had ordered this boy's death. He could not be left alive, and the girl activated her sacred aura, which boosted her strength from physical attacks. The girl turned to her companions, Shirai and Kaichi, and asked to borrow their strength so she could kill Sora. Shirai was also very pleased. Finally, his curse had been lifted, and now he could summon his weapon. Everyone understood that they had to get rid of Sora and kill him before he realized his power. And just at that moment, the assassin launched his attack. Once Sora learned to control his divine power, no one would be able to defeat him, and not even the gods could stop him. Enemies were closing in from all sides, and Sora stared at his mother's hand, tears blurring his vision. The longer the young man looked at her hand, the more it seemed to him that it was moving. And indeed, the moment came when the woman wiggled her fingers, and it became clear that she was still alive. A new portion of the curse, namely the soul chain, was directed against all those Isars who wanted to kill her beloved boy. Lady Yu Mukajima, having placed the chains of the soul upon the villains, stretched out her hand and called her son to her. The Ezras looked as if they were flies caught in a spider's web. They tried to break the soul chains, but simply froze in place. Sora took advantage of the situation and scattered the stones with his hands. Unfortunately, what he found there upset him greatly. His father and Jiro were dead, and his mother was showing signs of life. Sora began tearing at his hair, blaming himself for letting this happen. However, the woman tried to calm her son, despite her pain and physical condition. His mother asked her son not to worry about them and to leave the arena immediately, because he was incapable of doing it alone, and no one else would be able to withstand a battle against these opponents. From now on, the young man must stand firmly on his own 2 feet, and his mother would watch over her beloved son from heaven. The assassin Kaichi saw his opponent weeping over his dying mother and realized this was his chance. Kaichi was no honorable warrior. He did not let the man mourn the loss of his mother and began attacking Sora from behind, drawing his weapon. And just as his knife was about to pierce the unfortunate young man's body, Sora turned and looked the assassin in the eye. After that, Sora destroyed the blade of divine power with a single blow, and it crumbled in Kaichi's hands as if it were a plastic toy. Rimu couldn't believe her eyes, but she had just seen this guy break the divine blade with a single blow. The Lord shouted at his aides not to even try to block this guy's blows, and Rimu was ready for battle, holding a spear and a shield in her hands. Sora charged into the attack. The girl tried to hide behind the Valkyrie's shield, but it was pierced right through by the young man's bare hand before the stunned Ezra's eyes. Sora was highly motivated by the grief that had befallen him. He felt like a true monster and declared that he would kill every last one of them. Rimu was terrified. She realized that her opponent had absorbed divine power and had become even stronger. Now she was simply running for her life. Rimu shouted to her companions not to use divine power against this guy. Rimu didn't have time to do or say anything else, because very quickly, literally in an instant, Sora was right next to her and attacked the Ezru with a single powerful blow, sending her flying far away from the arena. The assassin tried to make sense of what he was seeing, but the speeds were so high that it defied explanation. The next moment, Sora was already next to the assassin, who hadn't expected such an encounter at all, and it was completely unclear how the young man had managed to spot him. The assassin realized that this guy was not only capable of absorbing divine power, but could also see right through his special stealth skill. And then a voice belonging to Shirai rang out. He said that, of course, Sora was having a great time in the fight right now, but he had probably forgotten something after all. Shiraya meant that the young man had left his dying mother to go and throw punches himself, because he was a truly worthless and ungrateful son. Shiraya raised his spear to finish off the woman, but the monk Yukio couldn't let that happen. Shiraya, of course, noticed the monk and aimed his spear straight at him. Sora was distracted from the assassin, watching as his comrade suffered from the Ezra. The assassin was lucky. To his fortune and surprise, Sora left him and rushed off to save his loved ones from Shirai. So far, everything was going exactly as they had wanted and planned. The Ezras were distracting the young man from one another, forcing him to constantly switch between opponents. In this way, they conserved their strength, managed to recover and attack. At that very moment, Shirai was already ready to unleash the flames of death upon the woman, who was still showing signs of life. The attack was already in full swing, but suddenly Shirai realized that his attack had abruptly stopped. When the smoke cleared, it became clear that Sora had managed to step between him and his mother and block the attack. Shiraya looked at the young man with great interest and surprise. He understood that something was about to happen because the boy was capable of absorbing divine power. Shiraya declared that he would now test how long this man would last and how many attacks he could withstand. Esar, the god of Ada, activated the flame of death once more and directed it at Sora. Rimu finally came to her senses and shouted at her companion not to act like an idiot, because right now Shiraya was simply feeding their opponent experience points. Divine power wouldn't help against a guy like this, just as close combat wouldn't. The girl had already experienced this firsthand. Shiraya unleashed a third attack of the Flame of Death, and of course it was useless against Sora. This time Rima was ahead of all her companions. She realized that divine power couldn't cause any harm, so she channeled the power into the stones, and at that speed, they were just as deadly as bullets. Perhaps the girl wouldn't be able to kill Sora with these stones, but she would destroy his dying mother easily and simply, and now Sora was forced to deflect the stones. Rimu watched with delight as the boy gave it his all, deflecting every stone flying at him and his mother. And then other Ezras joined in on the stone barrage. They were desperate to see Sora Mukajima die right then and there. No matter how hard the young man tried to fend off the barrage of stones, he couldn't cope with their sheer number, speed, and force. Soon, some stones began to hit the unfortunate woman, and she was already begging her son to let her die in peace. But Sora wouldn't agree. He didn't want to give up and said that if he couldn't protect his family, what was the point of living at all? Lord Makai said that this touching scene of love for his family made him sick to his stomach. The villain prepared a special arrow, and it didn't matter that the young man could absorb divine power. The Lord intended to put an end to this futile resistance, and he drew the Scissors of Atropos. This ancient relic belonged to the gods who weave destinies, and the Scissors of Atropos are capable of cutting even the divine. If used as an arrow and fired from a massive bow, no one would be able to block them. Lord Mukai said that he would sever the boy's very fate with these scissors. Meanwhile, Monk Yukio had come to his senses after the battle. It turned out he wasn't dead yet, though he was badly wounded. The monk raised his head. He sensed divine power and realized things were bad. Yukio shouted at the young man to run. However, in the next instant, the assassin was already standing next to the monk with a new dagger. He pressed the weapon against the monk's neck, telling him not to meddle in matters that weren't his concern. Sora also looked up at the sky. He didn't yet understand what Mukai had planned against him, but it was clear that things were bad. The young man heard his mother's voice and immediately turned to face her, his face streaked with bitter tears. The woman silently handed a small pouch to her son and said it was for him. She managed to confess her love to her son before a powerful blow rang out and an explosion tore the arena to shreds. Rich Mukai waited from above for the smoke to clear. He had received word that the sacrifice to the god Zeus had been made and that the god was pleased. After that, the man descended to the ground, where Rimu approached him. The girl didn't believe that Sora was dead and wanted to see proof in the body of the slain man. The Lord said that the god Zeus had accepted his sacrifice, so there was no need to worry now. Now they needed to think about something else, because in reality, the actions they had taken were essentially a declaration of war against all the other guilds, and they now needed to prepare for that. Some kind of heavy object fell into the underground lake from above, and the splashes soaked everything around it. It soon became clear that it wasn't an object, but Sora's body. Unconscious, he was sinking into the water, offering no resistance. The enormous stone cave was covered with stalagmites and stalactites. A stream flowed at its bottom, and everything was rather gloomy. An unfamiliar warrior with a huge sword in his hands walked through the cave, dragging the young man's body behind him by the leg. It was Sora, who had finally come to his senses from the jolting and the blows against the rocks. The young man realized he was alive and now wanted to know where he was. Soon, the face of his dying mother appeared before his eyes, and everything immediately came back to him and flooded his mind. Sora couldn't hold back his tears and began to cry, covering his face with his hand. After all, he had promised to protect his parents. So why had it turned out this way? The swordsman replied that it was unbecoming of a grown man to cry like a child. Sora was finally able to stand up. He asked the stranger where his parents were, if they were alive, and who had saved him. The swordsman, looking at the boy, replied that he resembled the chosen one, but at the same time had too many weaknesses. He needed to accept this reality as a fact. Your parents are dead because of you. Hearing these words, Sora felt like he was about to explode inside, but he knew it wouldn't help. The stranger took the boy firmly by the hand and said they needed to move on. But then the young man started throwing a fit. He began screaming, demanding to be let go because he was going to go back right now and find his parents, since they weren't dead after all. Sora felt that the stranger wouldn't let him go, and he wanted to strike the swordsman to free himself from his grip. But his hand was caught in some strange claws, and he couldn't land a blow. After that, the swordsman shoved the boy away and asked furiously how he dared to raise his voice at him. Could the young man really treat the man who saved his life this way, instead of thanking him? But if the situation was so deadlocked, then the swordsman, just as he had saved the young man, could just as easily kill him if they couldn't mend their relationship. The stranger explained that Sora's connection to the divine power had been severed by the Atropos scissors, and now without divine blessing, he was nothing more than an ordinary mortal. The swordsman said that they would restore the connection to the divine power within Sora, and he should approach this with understanding and gratitude. After that, the swordsman said they would teach Sora how to use the divine power properly. And now the boy could say whether he would go with the swordsman or stay here. Sora, though angry at this man, still understood what he had to do. He readily accepted and shook his hand, even though the swordsman asked him not to think of him as a good guy, since they were more like enemies. And that sounded very strange. The boys hadn't gone far when they suddenly saw someone in one of the dungeon's labyrinths. Monk Yukio blocked their path and said, until the swordsman explained who they were that he was talking about, the monk would not allow them to take his injured friend away. Shuzenji bowed deeply to Sora and apologized for failing to protect his family. As a result of the backlash from the divine power, he was swept underground and barely survived after falling into some kind of lake. But as long as the monk was alive, he would fulfill the promise he had made to the young man's parents. The monk warned the stranger, if he planned to use Sora's divine power for his own personal gain, he would never allow it. The swordsman was surprised, for this barely living monk was trying to act all-powerful. Yukio replied that he wasn't afraid of death, because clinging to life was a sin, so he wouldn't back down, and the monk removed the blindfold from his eyes. But he wouldn't be able to look the boy's parents in the eye when they met again in the afterlife, if he didn't fulfill and keep his word now. The swordsman replied that in this situation, they needed to ask this youngster's opinion, and Sora admitted that he dreamed of avenging his parents' deaths, but he didn't have the strength right now. And if this swordsman helps him awaken fully, then Sora couldn't care less who uses him. He's ready for anything. It was very painful to hear such words, but at the same time, he understood the boy and had to respect his choice and decisions. The monk took the sword from behind his back, handed it to the boy, and asked him to take it with him. It was a parting gift from his parents. Sora took the sword in his hands and felt a certain power. This power and these feelings had been familiar to him since childhood. It was the power of his mom and dad, but also something more. The monk confirmed that this weapon had been passed down among heroes for generations, and each of its owners had left their mark on it, but to fully claim it as his own, Sora would need divine power. Sora, as he was now, wouldn't be able to use it, but the boy still gazed in wonder at the sword, which held the memories of its owners. The monk explained that Lady Yu had entrusted the sword to him, saying that Sora would find a use for it when the time came, but for now he must take good care of it. Sora understood that the time would come, and he also thought that his mother had used her gift of foresight and knew exactly what she was talking about. The swordsman was tired of waiting and asked if the boys had finished their conversation or not. And now the three of them were walking through the long underground labyrinths. Sora told them how he had ended up in the tower, then escaped from it, then met his mom and dad again, and then lost them once more. And now the young man didn't understand where he was going at all, or what lay ahead of him. At that very moment, some strange creature sat on a throne. For many years it had shown no signs of life, but at that very moment, its eyes lit up with a bright light. The trio had been walking through some underground corridors for quite some time. The monk didn't even know there was such a vast space beneath the sixth refuge. The swordsman didn't understand why the monk had tagged along with them, but Yukio replied that he planned to protect the son of his deceased friend. The swordsman thought this was utter nonsense. The boy could easily beat up someone like the monk. Did he really need his protection? Yukio was very humble. He said that even if the boy didn't need his protection, he would do it at the cost of his own life. The fact was that Mrs. Yu had once warned them. If they followed her instructions, it would be better for everyone. However, after that, what happened happened. And now the monk had decided to no longer believe in prophets, but to trust only himself. The swordsman stopped arguing with the boys, but asked them to at least listen to him when they met God. Sora thought about his mother's words that it would be better for everyone. How could it be better if he was the only one who survived? Was this really the best ending for his mother? The young man looked sadly at the sword in his hands. Suddenly, the monk Yukio spoke up. He knew that city gossip claimed the so-called god was locked up in this cave, and now the monk wanted to know if the local god truly possessed divine power or if it was all lies. The swordsman didn't answer, believing it wasn't worth talking to fools, and then he added that they would soon see the god for themselves and draw their own conclusions. Sora also decided to ask a couple of questions. He asked the swordsman what kind of god they were talking about, but the swordsman replied that one must not utter his name thoughtlessly. Some more time passed, and soon the whole group emerged into a vast space. The swordsman warned that they had arrived at their destination and needed to stop chatting. After that, the man held his hands out toward the massive doors and began to speak some special magical words. The swordsman closed his eyes and said, "I stand before the Lord with a flame in my hand." And soon a sort of divine cloud seemed to form from his hand, and it gradually began to rise upward, breaking away from the swordsman's hand. This cloud approached the massive gates, which immediately began to glow and tremble, and the sound of the inner locks opening could be heard. The swordsman invited everyone to enter, but the monk had to remain outside until God gave him permission to enter. Yukio didn't argue and warned the young man to be very careful inside God's cave, because the divine power within Sora was extraordinary, and God might want to take it for himself. And as soon as the boys approached the doors, the swordsman pointed to the young man and told him to go first, because the god of intrigue and flame was waiting for him. Sora didn't argue or resist, but the god of intrigue and flame sounded very strange. But on the other hand, it didn't matter at all who he was. Even if this god tried to use him, Sora was certain that in the end, everything would turn out exactly as he wanted. As soon as the young man stepped inside the hall, his foot immediately landed in a magic circle. Yukio, though he remained standing outside, sensed that this room was filled with an overwhelming divine power. Sora walked deeper into the hall and looked like a tiny insect compared to the enormous silhouette towering above him. The young man surveyed the vast scale. Basically, this was exactly what you'd expect from a god. He was a giant of intrigue and flame. This was roughly how Sora had imagined the Norse god Loki. But he had a very strange form, and the years had not been kind to him. But then God opened his eyes, looked at the young man, and said that he had finally arrived. God was immediately very surprised, because this young man remained calm at the sight of God. It was immediately clear that he was no ordinary person. The god asked Sora if he wished to avenge his fallen family members. The young man was quite honest and sincere. He put his hand on his heart and said that this was the only reason he had come here. Sora's connection to divine power had been severed by a sacred artifact. If the young man wished to restore it, he would have to pay the appropriate price. Sora replied that he was ready to do anything for this. If God would help him, he was here precisely for revenge. God remained silent, and then the young man wondered, could it be that this was still not enough? Sora paused to think for a moment and added that divine power alone wasn't enough for him, because he needed absolute power to crush his enemies. Sora pointed his finger at God and asked if God could give him all of this. God demanded that the boy not get too big for his britches. Why did he think he could afford to throw words around so carelessly in the face of God? After that, God grabbed the boy and squeezed his hand tightly, nearly squeezing the life out of Sora. Sora smiled and told God that he had brought him here through his servant because God wanted something from him. Sora suggested God take a guess. Surely God was planning to suck out his divine power to revive that wreck he considered his body. Such insight and audacity greatly upset and enraged God, and he squeezed this arrogant boar even tighter. Sora realized he'd hit the nail on the head and suggested that God simply kill him and take all his power if he could. But when God did nothing, Sora realized that God simply couldn't do it, and that was the whole problem. In the end, God released the guy, sat him on his lap, and admitted that that was exactly the case. Sora possesses a power that suits God very well, but he cannot take it away. In that case, they were both in a complete deadlock, and Sora reached out his hand to the god of intrigue to shake it as a sign of reconciliation. Sora already knew that the power he had absorbed in the tower was comparable in strength to that of the Norse gods. But if even such a significant figure in Norse mythology as Loki cannot take away divine power, then that means Loki must treat a mere nobody like a human as an equal partner. Loki was forced to admit that this guy had guts. For a mere mortal, he was remarkably brave and fearless. And the god extended his claw to the young man, which he was to grasp as a sign of agreement and reconciliation, confirming their desire to work together in the future. But still, the god Loki wanted Sora to remember once and for all, None of those who had treated the god Loki with contempt had survived. Sora replied that such empty threats only fed the bright image of the mighty god. Loki already realized that this guy would be a real thorn in his side, but in his current state, Loki wouldn't last long anyway. God Loki really did look terrible and felt even worse, so he cleared his throat and said he would be brief. Sora realized that since they were partners now, he needed to show a little goodwill, so he addressed God respectfully and asked what he had in mind. Loki replied that the boy must return to the tower. Sora immediately recalled that dreadful abyss, where he had practically turned into a monster because he was constantly preoccupied with blood and killing. There are currently only 16 towers on the planet, each containing the various powers of the gods. Other Norse towers had also opened, but none of the beings familiar to the god Loki had awakened. And now Loki and Sora cannot allow other hunters to get their hands on their tower. Sora didn't understand why the other Norse gods hadn't awakened. And then the god could no longer contain his rage and confessed. The fact was, they had all been betrayed. He would explain the details later. For now, Sora needed to know only one thing. From now on, all the Greek gods are their common enemies. After all, Sora wants to gain the power to defeat all enemies in his path. And that is exactly the power Loki will give him, along with a choice. Sora would be able to absorb the power of the giant Surtur's flame, and a ball of fire appeared before the young man. Its fire will burn away all impurities in the young man's divine power, transforming it into a primal force that Sora will be able to control. But this power will have to be fueled by his own strength, and if his reserves are depleted, Surtur's flame will burn him to ashes from within. The second option is to plant the seed of Yggdrasil, the world tree, within the young man's body. It will then begin to evolve, transforming him into a suitable vessel for divine powers, capable of calmly mastering any divine power. But it would take years for this power to grow. This is the longest path, and Sora is unlikely to like it. The young man understood that the flame of Surtur would parasitize within him, and that it would take an eternity to wait for the fruits of the world tree. But it turned out there was a third option, to use the first and second. In this case, the world tree would grow faster, fueled by Surtur's fire, and the flame would burn away excess shoots, lightening the burden on the boy's body. But in the end, Sora will be doomed, and Ragnarok himself will come for his soul. Losing control for even a moment, Sora will immediately turn to the ashes of madness. That was all the god of intrigue and flame could offer, and now he waited to see what the young man would choose. Sora replied that there was no choice for him here at all. Of course, he would take it all, right away. The god Loki was delighted with the boy, believing him to have a wonderful spirit, and now Sora's body was bursting with new sensations. It felt as though he were burning entirely from within. A few moments later, marks appeared on his arms. Divine marks of fire and tree. The young man screamed loudly and writhed, while the god Loki explained that opposing forces were beginning to merge within his body. And while the rebirth was taking place, the god Loki pondered the oddities of life. Who would have known that the last hope of the Norse gods would end up in the hands of a mere mortal? At that very moment, somewhere in the city, the god of darkness, Fudel, was fighting a monster in a miraculous way. But suddenly his body seemed to start twisting, and he felt sick. At some point, Fudel realized that someone was stealing all his divine power right then and there. He would not allow anyone to invade the Scandinavian tower, and already the bodies of those who had tried to get in lay scattered around him. Several opposing forces met in the town square. Once again, they had to divide the territory. Mukai addressed the military. He said that there were now 17 towers. He was absolutely certain of this. The Lord was also certain that all these towers would belong to him and his supporters. Meanwhile, Sora, who was in the dungeon, was trying to coordinate the work of all his entities, but so far he had not succeeded. The swordsman and the monk looked very alarmed as they watched what was happening in the divine hall. The swordsman couldn't believe his eyes that this insolent youngster was about to absorb two opposing forces. Swordsman Yukio believed in the boy and prayed that Sora would endure this rebirth and trial. Sora finally came to his senses and looked around. Soon he saw a huge tree with many branches and realized that this was his spiritual world. It was the world tree, the seed of which he had planted within his own body. The young man noticed God sitting there with a book. He was completely engrossed in reading and didn't react to the boy at all. But soon he noticed that this mysterious being had stopped reading and was now looking at him. He said that the chaotic divine power contained within the young man allowed one to read the past. The deity said that the young man's entire spiritual world had been burned to the ground by the flames of rage. As a messenger of Yggdrasil, he could not bear to witness such a tragedy as the loss of parents, and now asked the young man for permission to restore this desolate land to its former flourishing state. Sora agreed, of course, but it was clear that this would not come for free. The god confirmed that this was indeed the case, but among humans, this is usually called a mutual benefit. The deity wanted Sora to choose him as his guardian, but the young man didn't understand who he was. But at that moment, someone let out a wild scream, warning the boy not to let himself be fooled. Flaming axes flew through the air, spinning like shurikens, and a few moments later the fire swordsman appeared before the deity with the book and cut off the green creature's head. The fire deity said that this green creature wanted to make the boy a slave of Yggdrasil and use him to turn the human world into food for the world tree. And now both representatives of the elements stood near Sora, and he had to somehow reconcile himself with them and them with each other. The tree insisted that they couldn't take the keeper, because the flames would burn the poor boy to ashes. And now a conflict had begun between the two elements, and they had once again resorted to quarrels and mutual accusations. The flame of Surtra asked if he had seen the green inner world of this unfortunate child. After all, everything inside was burned to ashes, except for this world tree. In the end, they stopped quarreling among themselves and turned to Sora, so that the boy himself could choose who would be his guardian. But before making a decision, the young man had to carefully read several pages from the magic book. The green guardian tore the pages from the book and handed them to the young man. It was the Book of the Essers. To become an ESR, a person must do several things. First, they must choose a guardian who will convey God's will, and then they will become a candidate for the ESRs. This person must enter the abyss and battle other candidates. After that, the winner will become an ESR, receive divine armor, and earn the right to enter the tower. The guardian guides his Ezra, grants him power, and punishes him for bad deeds. Ezra's divine armor allows him to borrow power from the gods themselves. The representative of the flame was very angry at this green old man, believing he should have been burned immediately. Sora realized that these two parts of him were fighting each other for the right to be his guardians. Flame and tree, founders from Norse mythology, are fighting over the young man. It's simply astonishing, since anyone would dream of being in his place. Both representatives waited with bated breath to see which of them he would choose. But the young man said that this pair didn't have a clue who they were dealing with. They act as if they've condescended to him or something along those lines. And they hope that whoever Sora chooses is destined to be a slave or something like that. But now the guy is going to explain the whole truth of life to them, because they are his pawns. Sora clamped both representatives in his hands and said that they were completely at his mercy and didn't need to act all-powerful. The flame of Surtra screamed pitifully as the young man shoved it into his mouth. After that, it was time to devour the spirit of the tree, which also went down his throat. Sora chewed both of his meals thoroughly, for his mother had always told him that one must chew well. It aids digestion. Sora gazed into his inner world and realized that from this day forward, even the gods would be his prey. Sora returned to his world, and with a light flick of his wrist, destroyed the sword he had been holding. The god of intrigue and flame waited patiently for it all to end and asked the boy what he had chosen, though Loki didn't really care, since Sora had fallen into his trap either way. Sora didn't answer the god's question. It seemed he was still thinking and pondering something. Finally, the boy looked at the god and asked if Loki really couldn't see for himself what he had chosen. After that, Sora jumped down from God's lap, saying bye to him as he left. Loki was deep in thought because he had seen an unusual symbol on the boy's arm. It belonged neither to the flames of Surtur nor to the World Tree. The god Loki realized that the young man had absorbed both, but that was impossible. No sooner had the military and Tiger's Roar sorted things out among themselves than news arrived that the first candidate for the 17th Tower's ESR had appeared. Richt Mukai was furious. He couldn't understand who could have beaten him to it. Ms. Tonosaki didn't know what to make of it either. Could there really be a traitor operating behind the scenes? And now former enemies. But from this moment on, allies rushed toward the 17th Tower in order to fight their way in and become its Ezras as well.